I think most of you know me if you're here. If you don't know me, I'm Craig Quat. I will be your instructor for this course. I'm also the inventor, the developer of this material. I don't think it's so important to go into like my background and how I got here. I would prefer to share the material with you guys first, and let that speak for itself. Because this is what's more important. But in general, I've been doing this. I started this project in 2010, and it took me a few years. It was a reverse design process. So I discovered the ideas intuitively through play and experimentation. And then in order to be able to share it, I had to sort of reverse engineer it. And that's what you're going to be seeing in this presentation is that reverse engineering, helping other people understand how these ideas work and how we can apply them. So for today's course, it's the introduction. We're going to be focused on philosophies, intentions, and solutions of juggling. So it's really going to be this first course is going to be designed to deconstruct our pre-existing ideas about juggling. So taking a look at what the thing is and what's caused it to be inaccessible. Because when we start to break down what the thing is and we compare it to other art forms, other activities, we start to see a lot of similarities in everything except the accessibility. So juggling is very similar to music. It's very similar to dance, but these activities are much more culturally accessible for people, and juggling never got there. So we're going to take a look at that question today. And then we're going to apply some of those ideas in the end of the course. For the course notes, the overview of the course, what we can expect from the intention here is that the training course is intended to give an overview of the theories plus social and emotional learning strategies of functional juggling. The ultimate goal is to empower each participant with the capacity and awareness to facilitate and create new forms of juggling environments. So you're going to hear me say this a lot and repeat these a lot of the ideas to you because it's about conditioning. But what I want you to understand is that the goal here is to empower you with a sense of knowledge that can allow you to develop in your own directions. You're welcome to copy and model and imitate the material that I'm sharing with you here, but it's important to understand that it's there for you to create with, not to institutionalize. Material is presented in a technical format. However, the ultimate application is intended to be intuitive, playful, and fun. So this is something I find is helpful. Not everyone needs to hear it, but because the material is presented in this very technical way, and I don't know if that's a product of just my style or the material itself, I'm trying to make it more accessible. But it does require a lot of technical conversations about a lot of technical things. And given that we all have different backgrounds, we might have different experience levels depending on the topics. So there may be some areas where you get a little bit confused, and there'll be some areas where it's like super obvious to you. It's really going to depend on your background. The thing that I like to emphasize is that don't be overly concerned if you are confused at any moment, because there is a lot of repetition of these ideas. And then when you apply them, it's very simple. The application itself is super simple. And what we're going to do is give like an extreme overview of the maximum potential that I've developed here. I'm going to share with you today. And that might not necessarily be valuable to you. It might not be something you're going to practice. But the course here is designed to give you all of that material so you can decide for yourself. But do keep in mind that if you are confused, when we do not the evaluations, but I try to structure student-led assignments where you're going to take the ideas and apply them, and we'll do feedback. And that's how I know. If anyone isn't doing well in those periods, then I know that we need to explain something else. So that is the thing to emphasize there. And then certificates will be available for all participants who want them and complete the course. And to give you an understanding of what the certificate is representative of is, because we don't like to institutionalize things, we want to be open, but it is important to have quality control. So what this certificate has come to represent over the last 6 or 7 years is the community of people who we've shared the theory with in this sort of way. So everyone who has this certificate, it means you have a shared base of knowledge with everyone else who has that certificate. You were exposed to the same information that everyone else was. I have certain personal feelings about certificates. I don't like to put emphasis on material things, but I do understand it's really valuable for us as circus educators, and just because we don't have institutionalized forms to prove our qualifications. So that will be available for you. and just to clarify its meaning, what its actual value is. What else can we say about the course? Yeah, I think I covered it. Equipment. So in general, it's good to have balls and beanbags available for all of the courses. I would say to have four. Always have about four beanbags, or preferably balls that rolls. If you don't have both, you want to have balls that can roll, because we do a lot of rolling in this course. So just have a couple balls around that you can roll, and then majority of the time we're going to be looking to interact with non-juggling objects. So just as long as you're in a space that has objects in it, you're going to be fine. The only way you would not be prepared for the course is if you were somehow like in an empty void where there were no objects, because we're going to be encouraging you to improvise, right? That's the idea. So like an empty gym, not a good place. You know, a cluttered office desk, great place. Kitchen table, another good place. So just try to be around things. And then juggle boards will be used. We will concentrate activities with the juggle board during the 4th and 5th classes, but they're not required. If you don't have one, there's a lot of ways to improvise and create, and maybe we can focus if during Q&A if anyone is struggling with that. But it's not hard to construct this idea. It doesn't have to be perfect. So if you don't have the board, that's okay. It's still going to be valuable to just talk about the philosophies and how we are changing the teaching models. It's still going to be valuable to observe that. But if you do have the board, it's going to be a more holistic experience for you, obviously. Because I really find that being able to apply the ideas as we're talking about them is really important. Otherwise, it remains abstract, you know, because it's abstract in its theory, but in its application, it's so simple and so fun. Class notes. So for today's class and for majority of the classes, I try to follow the same structure so you can be prepared and understand how to, you know, use your energy. So you can expect for most of the classes, with the exception of this one, that it's going to be about 1 hour of presentation and then 1 hour of activity. And then depending on the group size, you know, it could go a little longer, a little shorter. But today it's the course introduction, which I just did, talking to you about the intention. What my expectation is for you is not, my expectation is not that you become masters of this theory. I'm sharing the theory with you so that you can apply. That is the goal for me, is that all of you can create and apply, and that if you walk into a room and there's somebody who's so different than you, you've never seen this person kind of condition before in your life, you will be able to create juggling with that person. That is the ultimate outcome. So the course introduction we did, and then it's always going to be presentation of new materials, or in the future classes, we'll do a review. I always like to start with a review because the ideas are really connected, you know, so it's helpful to tie them together. And then application of activities, and then we do feedback and reflection and a recap. In today's class, you're not going to have a creative period, but towards the end, we're going to do an activity. I'm going to model a certain lesson plan that I have for you, so we can use it not really to sort of apply the conversation we're having. And you'll be able to follow along with that. So for today's activity, you are going to need 3 bean bags and 1 ring. So if while I'm talking, you guys can organize those and make sure you have. If you don't have a ring, anything that is sort of similar, you can take cardboard and cut out the same shape. You know, it's more about giving us the structure to interact with. Cool. So have those ready. The intention of the class is to develop awareness of teaching strategies through personal experience and application. So this is also where I really find the learning occurs too, and why it's nice to have such a diverse group. It's when you guys apply, share, and reflect is obviously when majority of the learning happens. And although some of the materials may appear technical in their origin, it is important to remember that their applications are always intended to be playful, organic, and fun, and that learning is going to occur in layers. Because we're taking a pretty big jump here from our classical understanding of what juggling is, and that's not necessarily an easy transition for everyone. Some of us it might be, but if we have been conditioned with a lot of these misunderstandings, then it takes a few exposures, right? And I try to design the course as best as I can to really consider that when you're learning. Which is why I say don't be worried about being confused, because there's going to be a lot of aha moments. And it's going to be, we have to kind of talk about what the things are and then what their implications are, and then reflect on why we created them that way. So it's a lot of this like horse before the cart type of understanding. It's sort of impossible to really appreciate until we see the whole picture. but because of the limitations of space and time, I have to sort of introduce the ideas one at a time for you. Um, so I'm going to emphasize that at the beginning of every course. Because I observe when I give this class, like sometimes there's people who they get super stressed out because it's not their background, and they think it's juggling, and they see a lot of numbers and technical terminology, and they get so stressed out. And if you are feeling that way, I want you to remember what I'm saying right now. Don't feel stressed out. It's going to be super simple and super fun, and everyone here is going to have success. So for today's topic, we begin with this deconstruction. It's more about a series of questions that guides us to our solution, right? So to understand the solution, we have to understand the problem, and to understand the problem, we have to begin with what the thing is that we're trying to solve. So we begin with this very simple question: what is juggling? And it really opens up, though, because it seems on the surface it's simple, but juggling is a kind of an abstract thing to describe. And when you ask people about it, you get a lot of different explanations. And this process of deconstructing the meaning of this word, or our understanding of its experience, is going to guide our conversation to begin with and help us. The goal of this section is that we arrive at a place where we are open to understanding juggling in a different way. Maybe you're not going to be convinced today because we don't provide all the solutions, but we should, at the end of this class, have a lot of questions, have a lot more questions than we did before, and not make so many assumptions. So you're also going to talk about its accessibility. I guess this kind of relates to the benefits. If you could do a whole entire seminar on the impacts of juggling, which is why I tell you there's so many directions we can go now. But one of the ways I like to consolidate this conversation for all of us, or to connect us, because I do observe, if I use juggling in this way, it has this impact. If I use it this way, it has that impact. But no matter how I use it, all of the ways that I use juggling, it's always going to have a global activation impact. And global activation is a particular state of mind that we can observe. We have the technology. We recognize the state of mind exists. And we know it has there's certain activities that are associated with it: music, dance, and juggling being primary examples, but many other activities, because it relates to a flow state. And we're going to break down that state of mind, because this is how we arrived at our solution to begin with. There's a lot of reverse engineering going on. So rather than look at juggling from the outside and try to understand it going in, we look at it from the inside and try to construct it going out. So we start with its state of mind, and we'll be talking about that today. And how that, because it's a state of mind, it doesn't relate to any action. That's what makes it universally accessible. So there's this huge misconception of inaccessibility in juggling. And I used to, when I began this project at the beginning, I felt my responsibility was to make juggling accessible, or make juggling more accessible. And through this process of reverse engineering and sharing and experiencing different cultures around the world, what I came to understand is that I don't need to make juggling accessible. We don't need to make juggling accessible. Juggling is accessible. It's naturally accessible, just like music and dance are. What we need to do is deconstruct our cultural barriers and our misunderstandings that cause it to be inaccessible. So if we could do that, the juggling itself is available. We just need to learn from our mistakes. So that's going to bring us into a conversation about teaching models and how we introduce juggling. And because the learning model is going to determine its accessibility, right? The learning model for music determines that it's more accessible. The learning model for dance determines they're more accessible. The learning models for juggling determine it to be not accessible. And we're going to take a look at that inaccessibility, what causes it, what we got wrong. And then we're going to use an alternative example. So I have a model lesson. This is not like a fixed solution. It's just to sort of point us in the direction to say, okay, if we're understanding juggling in this way now, and we evaluate the failures of its teaching models, what's a way that we can begin to reconstruct that lesson? How can we redesign that classical 3-ball tossing lesson to be more inclusive? We can redesign juggling itself to be inclusive for everyone, but in particular, this 3-ball tossing cascade lesson that everyone assumes is the start point of juggling. We're going to be taking a look at that and using it as a model to apply this conversation that we're having. Ready? Let's go. I think this class is the biggest marathon for me out of all the classes, because I'm going to be doing a lot of talking right now. And I'm aware that takes energy from you too. So I try to make it. I'm working on these slides. I'm trying to add images and things to help keep this part engaging because I'm definitely one of those people too. Like it's hard for me to concentrate for long periods of time if I'm sitting. So if you're having trouble, you want to get up, you want to walk around, no problems. I can't even see you while I'm presenting, so don't worry about it. I won't be offended, and I'm aware. So, but if we push through this day, then the rest of the classes are going to be a lot more smoother paced. But right now, it's more about me just tearing apart whatever pre-existing ideas you had. So I want you to be dazed and confused. So let's start with this question: what is juggling? What is juggling? If it is our goal to increase the accessibility of juggling for everyone, then we should begin by establishing what we mean to describe by the word juggling. This seems obvious. This is because understanding clearly what the thing is that we are trying to share will better enhance and guide our ability to further develop its educational models. So another thing I observed in traveling and working with different teachers is not everyone's trying to teach the same thing because not everyone thinks juggling is the same thing. So you end up with different teaching models. Majority of people are trying to teach juggling as a technique, that's for sure. Um, the reason, I think part of the reason we see so many variations is because we don't have a clear understanding, because we have this cultural misunderstanding, this disagreement within our own communities of what is the meaning of this activity. And that's getting in the way of us being good teachers. So we need to solve that problem. Deciding what it actually means to juggle can be a challenging task with some considerably difficult, mostly cultural barriers to overcome. In this moment. Okay, so part of the reason we're asking this question is because in observing existing, you know, so many examples of different people who present definitions of juggling. If you Google juggling and you look on Wikipedia and you look in other resources, even our own community's databases for explanations, you're going to find that all of these explanations or all of these descriptions of juggling rely on explaining it based off of its physical expressions. So they talk about the throw, they talk about the action that we use to create the juggling. And that's not helping us. That automatically is making us inaccessible because there's always going to be someone who can't perform a particular action. And if a person isn't able to perform the action of throwing and catching, and now you're telling me that means they can't juggle, I don't accept that. I don't think that's the truth. So we need to look a little bit deeper to say, okay, well, if it's not its action, like let's have a conversation. What else can it be, you know? So let's take this example, really classic example. I've heard this conversation so many times. Poi. Poi is not juggling. Poi is juggling. So many people argue about this thing. So poi, for example, is certainly recognized as object manipulation, but not everyone would agree that poi is juggling. This is because it deeply depends on which cultural interpretation of the idea each person selects to determine its value. So it really comes down to the difference of, am I trying to understand juggling from the outside, or am I trying to understand juggling from the inside? If we were to evaluate the activity based on our list of its expressions alone, which is the current standard of how we understand juggling, so juggling is throwing, juggling is catching, juggling is spinning, juggling is bouncing. If this was my way to understand juggling, and that action of poi wasn't on my list, or someone invented some new form of manipulation and I'd never seen that action before, well, those guys are not included within my understanding of this activity. Whereas alternatively, if we evaluated these activities based off the relationships they allow us to form with space and time, and the particular unique states of mind that those types of activities relate to, then we would understand all of these forms of object manipulation as essentially being different expressions of the same thing. So to conclude this misunderstanding, or what we got wrong from the start here, is that juggling cannot and should not be defined by the outcomes of its physical expressions alone. To describe juggling in such a way is to attempt to define all of music by one instrument or all of dance by one style. We don't do this with music. Why do we do it with juggling? I don't know. But the second you try to define anything by its action, you automatically alienate some body. Some human body will not be able to do that because human beings are diverse. So we need a solution that is universal. We need a solution that doesn't relate to its action somehow to talk about juggling in another way. Because it is this cultural error of trying to understand juggling as action, as opposed to the states of relationships between actions, which is universal to every human being. It's what causes juggling to become so inaccessible to so many people in the first place. And I guess this is what I mean by saying we have to take responsibility. It kind of stinks to become aware of this, that like, oh crap, like we got it wrong, we did something wrong here. And I think that's why, like, I get a lot of defensiveness from people sometimes, a lot of resistance to this idea sometimes from certain groups of people. And I think it has to do with that. My reflection on it is that sometimes people feel offended when I start to say like, "Hey, we did it wrong," but the intention is not to offend anyone or tell or punish anyone. The intention is for us to be reflective and to accept our errors so that we can improve upon them going forward. Right? Shouldn't be so hard. So if juggling is not its action, then what else could it? How else could I possibly understand this? I hear this a lot from people. If juggling is not its action, what is it? We're going to talk about that. The way we solve this conversation, the way we end this debate, because the debate is really holding us back. It's wasting time. We shouldn't be arguing about if poi is juggling or not. We should be working together to make poi more accessible to everyone and juggling in general. The language isn't important. It's the impacts, the value. So the way that we simplify this conversation is we make a difference between the expression and the experience of an activity, and this is true for everything. It's not just juggling. Um, the expression of the activity is going to be the medium that we use to produce this experience. So it's its action, and what's important to understand about that is actions are subject to change. The action of an experience is not fixed. The part of the experience that is fixed is the universal state between these actions. So the universal state of interaction, which is not related to the outcomes of its expression. And the experience is not something that we can change. If we change the experience, we change the experience. But I can change the expression without necessarily affecting the experience. And what do we mean by that? If you take a look at these three pictures, these three images at the bottom of the slide, in each of these images, each person is processing the same sequencing relationship with space and time. We call that sequencing relationship a cascade, but they are each expressing it in different ways. In the first example, it's bounce juggling, but it's a cascade. The relationship between events and how the human brain is having to process that experience is the same in the first example as it is in the second example, and it is in the third examples. We visually process them as being very unique and different because visually they are very different, and that's the point of changing these props. We are performers. We're trying to create visual differences. But the reality, when you look at the relationships between what each of these people are doing, there is no difference. It's only in its visual representation. So understanding, evaluating that there's an obvious connection between each of those expressions, right? We now have something we can start to, a little piece of string we can pull on. Look, all of these three expressions, they're different, but they're the same. What is the same about them? And this is where we're going to introduce the formula solution, which is an attempt by me to describe juggling in a way that doesn't reflect its action, because this is going to be the ultimate goal. If we can find a way to do that, then we have our solution. It's the action that limits the accessibility of juggling, whereas the relationship is universal. So I'm going to introduce to you this formula solution right now. It's going to appear confusing the first time you've seen it. If you haven't read the book yet, and this is the first time you've seen it, it's going to look confusing. The definition, or I like to call it a formula, is a managed anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space and time. Or really, it's harmonized by space-time, but that terminology, I think, intimidates people more. So I say space and time. Important, this description does not attempt to define the meaning of juggling. Meaning is subjective. So if anyone is starting to feel offended, remember, the personal meaning of juggling is subjective. We always encourage that. Instead, what we are trying to do with this formula, with this description, is to somehow describe the smallest possible combination of the sensory and sequencing relationships which juggling allows us to form, and that we associate with the state of mind that we recognize as being juggling. So going back to the introduction, we're going to be talking about global activation, this particular state of mind that juggling causes us to enter, and the impacts of that state of mind, which are massive. And we are going to be looking at that, and we're going to try to deconstruct that idea. That's what this formula does, is it tries to say, okay, what produced that state of mind? If that's the state of mind I end up in when I juggle, what was it about my behavior that caused me to get there? And that's what this solution does. And this solution, once we learn to understand it and apply it, It's what allows us to be compartmentalized with our learning strategies, because we understand each of the conditions. We can take conditions out and put conditions in and create activities that are focused on parts of the formula, and take out others, so we can structure a learning model that's um, more inclusive. But to generally, it breaks down into four parts, and we're going to talk about each of these in the next slide. But to show you now, the first part is a managed. So in order to be experienced, something has to be managed. Anti-entropic sequence, which is a fancy way of describing a pattern of events that repeats itself. And orbital events, because if I have a pattern of events, I need events to make a pattern with. So we have a description of the type of events that we interact with when we juggle. So anti-entropic sequencing describes the behavior, and then the orbital events describes the relationship of the behavior with space itself, and then harmonized by space-time, or space and time. And that has to do with the sensory relationship we form with juggling, which is a critical component. And this fourth part too is the part that we gives us the most flexibility, is understanding this part of the stimulation of juggling, which is really where people tend to become overstimulated, because it's requiring us to do a lot of sensory regulation and a lot of sensory communication. Understanding this component of the formula allows us to create a lot of activities that are more accessible by removing this component, by saying, okay, that part of the equation produces a lot of sensory stimulation and it's not helpful for this person yet. Let's take that part out and let's just focus on developing anti-entropic sequencing relationships with orbital events, but not necessarily having to interact with external sensory information at the same time. This is what this equation allows us to do. But to break it down in its components for the first time, and this is one that definitely takes layers. It comes to you at the beginning as sort of like a scratch your head type of thing, and the more we apply it, the more obvious it becomes. So the first part is a managed. The formulas of juggling appear all around us in nature. Anti-entropic sequences of orbital events is a description of nature, but we only recognize them as being juggling once we are able to be once they're able to be experienced as an extension of one's own self. So in order for juggling to exist, it has to be experienced, because its equations, its formulas do appear all around. It's a reflection of nature. The frequencies of juggling are a reflection of nature, just like music and dance. It's the same idea. But we don't call it music, when it's occurring naturally. We call it music when we produce it. Anti-entropic sequence. This is a fancy way of saying a structured pattern of events that repeats itself. We use the term anti-entropic here because we are trying to draw attention or point out our sensory relationship to time that we form with time, and how anti-entropic sequences affect that sensory relationship with time. In general, we process time in a linear way. We live in a universe that contains entropy, high entropy, meaning that things tend to go from states of order to disorder. And you don't need to understand all the physics behind this, but from a very basic sensory standpoint, the understanding how we create our sense of time is important, because when we interact with juggling, we interact with time in a different way. Because I'm able to construct linear time by referencing changes in space, references changing in my environment. If my environment doesn't change, then my sense of time becomes distorted. If you imagine, when people say, oh, I froze time, in the movies, what do we see happen? Nothing moves, nothing changes. If there's no change, there's no time. So an anti-entropic sequence reduces change in space over time, which helps to distort my linear sense of time. And this becomes relevant to the state of mind that we are trying to create, this global activation. In order to allow the brain to process in this altered state of mind, we need to reduce our awareness of linear time. And then the third component, orbital events, it sort of works as like a fractalization. It's a reinforcement of that distortion of our relationship with time. From a practical standpoint, in order for me to continuously interact with objects, they need to return to me. But from a sensory standpoint, when we interact with events that are orbital, or you could even use the word oscillate in here, is synonymous. That also acts to distort, because it's the repetition. There's movement, but there's no change to that movement. It's orbital. So you have a pattern of events that repeats, and then you have events themselves that are repetitive, both of which are acting to distort our linear sense of time by reducing how much reference we have to change in space over time. And music and dance use the same formula. It's the exact same structure. This right now defines music and dance. Think about, how do you construct music? in anti-entropic sequences, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and you use orbital events. These events are frequencies of sound, but it's the same idea. Um, and this last component, the harmonized by space and time, this is describing the sensory relationship we form with this interaction, with this sequence of events. Um, and this is sort of unique. Not every activity requires us to do it, and I think this is heavily involved in the stimulation of the state of mind as well. And this portion of the description is where we are able to identify and distinguish this definition from music, dance as well, or other activities that are similar. Um, because we focus on the type of the way we are is more about the expression now, because the only difference between music and juggling is its expression, how we process it sensory wise. So one of the more unique things we can say about juggling is that its tempo or frequency of interaction is not determined by the juggler, but rather by the relationship that a juggler forms with the juggling. So when I begin to juggle, it's not me who determines the tempo. I'm having a conversation with space and time and matter to determine which tempo is correct. And I can alter my behavior to change the tempo, but ultimately the outcome of that tempo is established as a dialogue. It's not something that I insist on. So learning to have that conversation, that sensory dialogue, is very stimulating. It requires a lot of processing and communication capacity from your brain. And this is the component that I think with all of these expressions, with all of these examples of music, dance, and juggling, that is really the part that we need to focus on the most in our educational models, because it has to do with sensory feedback. You're not able to develop this capacity unless you have sensory feedback. You have to receive information so your brain can process its errors. If I don't get sensory feedback, then I'm not able to develop this type of relationship. It's like sort of learning to speak a new language. So this is our equation to begin with. And it might seem complicated at first, but by the end of the course, it's going to be a really consolidated way for us to look at an activity and recognize immediately, does that activity have the potential to stimulate the state of mind that we call juggling? It's going to help us evaluate and design. But today it's probably just going to confuse us. So let's take a look at the state of mind that this equation is going to produce, or that we came to this conclusion based off of. Global activation. There are many ways we can structure the conversation about juggling's benefits and its impacts. But I think there's a lot of overlap in the impacts of juggling as well. So one of the things did in my early research was try to not focus on the benefits of impact that I could find, or the benefits of juggling that I observed other disciplines could produce. So the technical aspects of juggling, the increased motor control capacity, all those things, I can do that with other activities. So that doesn't make juggling special. So what I'm really focused on with juggling is the part of juggling, its benefits, its impacts, that are the most universal and are the most unique. And that is the state of mind that it produces. We have different language for this. Many of us use different language to describe this activity, and that's fine. But sort of recognizing what it is important for us. I also find that this terminology is something that helps simplify the conversation as well when we're trying to talk to other people about what are the main impacts of juggling. So juggling is a sensory activity which involves the mild distortion of our relationships with space and time, as we described in the formula, right? Reduced reference to indications of change in time and change in space over time distorts our sense of linear time. This subtle change to stimulation may seem small on the surface. We see people dance, we see people play music and juggling. We don't think, oh, look at them entering this altered state of mind. It doesn't look like that on the surface. But underneath, and personally, we're aware of it. We know what it feels like, the endorphins, the dopamine, right? Underneath, it has a profound effect on the way that we are able to interact with and process information. It really changes the way the brain is organizing information while we are experiencing these activities. This altered state of mind can be recognized by its hyper yet fluid states of communication, and is what we refer to as global activation. And under such conditions, we observe cross-regional communications taking place all over the brain at the same time. This is also something we recognize as being part of a flow state or meditation. So if you observe brain activity when a person is conscious and intentional with their behavior, when they have a clear sense of linear time, the brain operates with a sense of intention. It's anticipating. The human brain has a strange relationship with time. It's one of the reasons, like our thumbs and our understanding of future is what makes us human, really. So it's no, it's not, it shouldn't be surprising that by changing our relationship with time, that we would have this impact on the brain, that it will cause the brain to start to process information in a different way. Um, and what global activation, we see this music, and music is like the primary example. Musicians, they always talk about how playing any musical instrument causes global activation. And it's really this global activation that's causing the growth to happen. Because if you compare juggling to a traditional sport, you're going to see both activities are going to cause enhanced motor control and visual processing of information. So those two particular regions of the brain are going to be developed in both traditional sport and juggling. But juggling is developing a lot more than that, than traditional sport is. It's developing all regions of the brain simultaneously, and it's creating pathways of communication between regions that don't typically communicate. So in this sense, you can see now we're reaching a level of like connectivity that's, you know, close to the type of connectivity we expect from speaking another language. You know, so learning to play a musical instrument, learning to juggle, it's at that level of development. It's, you know, giving someone a bilingual capacity, because it's making connection. Like language is connected to all regions of the brain, right? Because for every idea we have a word. You know, so this is, if you can integrate learning into language, it expedites it, right? And human beings were able to learn so fast because we have language like this. Um, but also, if you can integrate learning into this state of mind as well, it has a pretty powerful impact. To help explain this state of mind, to give it more clarity, because I think it's still something science is trying to understand. We are still trying to understand it. We know it's there, we see it, but we don't really get what it is and why we have all these cultural traditions of behaviors like music and dance that encourage us to enter that state of mind. Like human beings throughout history have always, you know, all the things we do in life that aren't necessarily functional tend to relate to this particular state of mind. Um, what was I going to say about this state of mind? So can sleep is the best way I have, the best analogy to try to explain this. Because really understanding our relationship with time and how that impacts how we process information. Because when we go to sleep, we consider this to be subconscious. When I'm asleep, I'm not conscious, right? And during this time, I don't have intention. The concept of time is not linear when I'm asleep. And because of that, the brain starts to behave in a different way. It starts to synchronize and harmonize its signaling to flush out and clean and restore information. It does incredible things while we're asleep that it can't do while we're awake when I have intention. So consciousness and awareness of linear time causes me to have more intention. It puts more restriction on the pattern of communication that my brain behaves with. Whereas if I can find a place in between those two states of mind. So play causes this to happen as well. When you're playing, it's like the brain isn't processing time. When you play, you're just reacting to the environment. You're an extension of the world. And that changes your relationship with time, and it changes the way you process information. So this is global activation is a byproduct of play as well. And that's the intention of a lot of our facilitations, is to distort our participants' relationships with time and to help them enter a state of play where they're not focused on time, because that's what's gonna allow the brain to behave in this way that it would not otherwise be able to. In terms of accessibility, to start to really put this like into focus, like we know the juggling hasn't always been accessible, because of the way that we present it, but um, there's absolutely no reason it should not be, because when you look at the science, what it shows us very clearly is that the overall cognitive impacts of learning to juggle are not associated to the development of its skill level. Like I just said, if you compare the impacts of juggling to traditional sport activity, you're going to see, you know, similar impacts for motor control development, but you're not going to see all this other growth that's going on. And this other growth is astonishing. Like it's a rapid amount of growth. It's a divergent type of growth. It enhances the entire system's communication capacity. Like that's a whole nother level of impact. The cognitive impacts, however, are not correlated to the amount of time a person spends engaged, are only correlated to the amount of time the person spends. It's not correlated to skill level. It doesn't matter how good you are at juggling. It matters how much time you spend engaged with the activity, how long your brain is stimulated to be in that state of mind, to be processing globally. If you experience juggling for 1 hour, you receive 1 hour of its benefits. It doesn't matter if you do it at a high level or low level, or now every level is relevant. You know, you might need 7 balls to stimulate this state of mind to get that chemical reaction, whereas somebody else might need 2 or 3. It's relative to each person's experience. That's what I mean about like the absurdity that juggling could ever be inaccessible when we see this quality of its impacts. because it puts juggling right alongside things like yoga and meditation, which science also understands to have the same sort of effect. You know, when you meditate, it's not about how good you meditate. It matters how long you spend in this cleared state of mind where you're not processing time. And with yoga, it's the same thing, and that's why these particular activities have been integrated so rapidly and so much into society, because we know this about them. These are activities that are relative. The impacts are relative to how much time the person spends engaged. That makes them universally inclusive. That, you know, we don't. There's no discrimination with these forms of activities, and to understand that the impacts of juggling are completely aligned with this. Um, it should be accessible. We should be making it accessible. So there's nothing about its physical form that makes it inaccessible, and there's nothing about its state of mind that makes it inaccessible as well. What makes it inaccessible is its education. So, um, as I said before, it's juggling is not inaccessible. We make it inaccessible, right? So we got to the point now in this conversation where we're talking about juggling. We want to try to understand it in a way where we don't have to describe its action. We just talked a little bit about its state of mind. There's a whole lot of science there. Like if you Google global activation, you'll find a lot of reading material. Um, and then we have this formula solution. And the entire goal here is to try to find a way to describe juggling, to understand juggling that is not related to its action. Because once we do that, then that's where all these other problems emerge from too. So the key mistake we made is trying to understand juggling as an action as opposed to a relationship, the way that we do with music. So having made that mistake, we need to look at the impacts. How does that mistake cause all this other inaccessibility? And to start with, the primary inaccessible point of juggling, as we understand it now, is that it's not its action. You know, as long as we describe juggling by its action, it's always going to be inaccessible to somebody. When in reality, if you look at its state of mind and how that state of mind reflects, we recognize that state of mind in other activities, and it's always a reflection of a distorted relationship with time. That's what, because we can only process information in relationship to the way that we process time. We are restricted by this limitation, but we can distort this relationship. So understanding juggling as a formula, not as its action, is something we got wrong. The second thing we got wrong is where we choose to determine the start point of its activity, and this is the error I feel that is the most unnecessary, and it really confuses me. Like, I know there's no history to research on this, but like how this became this cultural understanding. How did we end up at this point where the three ball tossing cascade is where juggling starts? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So typically the start point of most juggling lessons, not all, there are good teachers out there who understand not to do this. But a lot of programs, especially when you get into mainstream education, it's like, give me the three ball cascade. Like day one, everybody's doing three ball cascade. Like that's the expectation. Why we have this expectation doesn't make sense, because if you compared that to the way we educate music, you're asking the student to start with a very complicated instrument and to play a very complicated song. That's not the beginning. The three ball cascade is toss juggling is a complicated way, a difficult way to express juggling. We're not required to throw objects when we juggle. And to do that particular pattern with three ball tossing cascade is a really complicated sequence. Juggling has many other sequences that are much easier to process, if we have an understanding of how we process that information. But if we don't, if we never take the time to learn about those things and we only think about juggling as its action, then yeah, we're going to come up with these stupid ideas. So having the start point of juggling at the three ball tossing cascade is ridiculous. It's absurd, and it's unnecessary. We don't need to do that. That's completely something we created. The model of learning we applied to develop its capacity is the area that we're going to focus on the most now, because for the first two, those are easy things to change. Okay, we got it wrong. We got our understanding of the thing wrong. We focused on developing its action instead of its relationships. Check. That's easy to change. It's, just changing an idea. And where we choose to determine start point. We don't have to determine the start point as the three ball cascade. So those are sort of cultural things. They're really quick. They're really easy for us to just change our opinions about. It's this third part that it takes a little bit more time to unravel. Because in determining that the start point is the three ball cascade and that it has to be thrown and catch, the model of learning we apply to develop that capacity is really ineffective and not helpful. And I would even say it is abusive, this form of teaching that we've been using for however long we can remember. So the classical model of learning to juggle uses a process known as scaffolding. It works by taking the outcome of a goal, let's say the ability to jump 1 meter high, and it divides it up into smaller goals that follow a linear path of progression from point A to point B. So maybe on day one, we focus on jumping 20 centimeters high, on day two, 30, day three, 40, and so on and so on. Linear scaffolding, many of us use this in our everyday teaching strategies. It's sort of the most intuitive without even knowing it. But if you are someone who's looked into education, then you would know it by this term, scaffolding. Although this works well for developing linear capacities, it is a very effective form of structured learning, and we use it in mainstream education all the time. But when you're working with like physical activities, it really it's not always the best model because it doesn't allow us to have experience as part of its learning process. And we're gonna really break that down now. What I mean by that. So to start with, this is the classical idea of scaffolding, and this is like education 101, right? But just to point it out and to make the comparisons for us to how we applied this idea to our classical understanding of teaching juggling, right? So we define the start point of juggling as the 3-ball tossing cascade, or when we define the start point. So if the 3-ball cascade is our start point, and we apply this effective means of education, linear scaffolding, in this context, there is no way to structure the experience of its activity into the process of learning how to do it. So in the case of jumping, the person's always jumping. They're always experiencing jumping. They're always getting feedback about jumping. And when we structured toss juggling this way, we end up with a structure that looks like this. We start with 1 ball, then we go to 2 balls, and then 3 balls. Those are not the same experiences. Each step changes the experience. Each step is its own learning lesson. And we put them all into one. Why? I don't know, because we think they go in this way. Or it's logical if you apply the linear scaffolding, but when you evaluate how that learning process is different now because it lacks experience, it becomes very clear why that learning process fails so much. Because in this situation, the person is not able to get in the same experience, so they're not developing the same capacity each step of the way. They're unrelated. So linear scaffolding isn't going to work because the end result is that it's an outcome-based model of learning. So the student, the entire time they're learning, they are not getting sensory feedback. They only get the sensation of juggling once they've learned how to juggle. So it's not a process where they get sensory feedback because if they drop, they don't get feedback. So defining juggling this way, structuring the lesson this way, we remove the sensory feedback of the activity, which is why it's so hard for people to learn. We talked about that fourth condition of having to harmonize with external spatial information. So the first thing we need to understand about learning to juggle, just like learning to play music, is that experience is a requirement of the learning process. It's absolutely a requirement of the learning process. If you can imagine trying to play music without hearing sound and trying to juggle without catching balls, right? Like it starts to become more clear where the learning gap is occurring. To make a comparison, the comparison we make is with the bicycle and the swimming. It's in the book as well. We use the same comparison to talk about how those activities are also things that you're not able to experience until you're able to do, right? When you don't know how to ride a bicycle, you fall over. So you're not getting sensory feedback information in that situation either. But we have some pretty simple solutions, right, for those. I'm sure you can imagine right away. That are sort of similar to this idea of the juggle board, right? Trying to create opportunities for people to be able to experience the sensation of the activity as they're learning, putting less emphasis on what it looks like and how we apply it technically, and more emphasis on our ability to experience it as part of its learning process. So experiential learning. Not being able to experience something as part of its own learning process certainly makes it more difficult to learn. However, juggling is not alone in this capacity. So when you first recognize this about juggling, like, oh yeah, I'm not getting feedback information, right? There's this learning gap. It seems like, well, that's why. Okay, so that's why juggling's inaccessible and there's nothing we can do about it. But wait, there are many other activities that have that same learning barrier that are massively accessible and massively inclusive. For the classic examples are swimming and bicycling. Majority of people know how to do one of these activities. But the thing is, in these circumstances, the consequences of failure are much higher compared to the risk of learning how to juggle. However, the nature of their inaccessibility remains the same. I think that's the key difference between these activities and why it helps explain why for so long in juggling we failed to apply these same learning strategies when it's so obvious, because there was no risk. There's no physical risk when you're learning to toss juggle. Like the beanbag's going to bump you in the eye. It's not going to, we don't need to provide physical safety in that situation. Whereas the consequences of learning and failure the learning process of riding a bicycle or swimming are very big. You could potentially hurt yourself or die if you're not careful with those activities. So I believe that's what encouraged us to develop these training tools, the training wheels, flotation devices. And then a byproduct of those tools, which were meant to provide safety, they created a platform by which people could then begin to experience and gain some level of sensory feedback information about the activity they are learning. Now scaffolding can begin to take place because there's a potential for experience. So it is not possible to experience swimming without being able to swim, nor is it possible to experience bicycling without being able to bicycle. And yet both of these activities are widely accessible to many people, whereas the experience of traditional toss juggling are not. This is kind of interesting, no? We're seeing a pattern here. Other activities that provide the same learning challenges that are more inclusive, other experiences like music and dance, which provide the same stimulation and are also more inclusive. And juggling keeps getting left behind. It's really strange. What's happening? Another comparison I'll make for those of you who work in circus, social circus classrooms, or like social circus projects, community circus-based projects, when you're letting your students play with all the different, when your goal is to develop all their capacities, all the disciplines. I've worked in a lot of projects like this, and I always observe that what are the favorite activities? What are the apparatus and the activities in our circus classroom that tend to get the most attention right away? And the two that I observe to be at the highest is, or the three is really aerials, balance, and acrobatics, like tight wire, a low wire, and like trapeze. Why is that? Why do people gravitate towards those activities at the beginning? Because those are all activities that you're able to experience as you're learning very easily. Once I'm on the trapeze, whether I'm doing a trick or not doing a trick, I'm experiencing trapeze. So I'm doing trapeze. I'm gaining every moment I'm on the trapeze, I'm getting sensory feedback information about that experience. So I'm developing capacity no matter what. I'm learning in that process. And then with like a low tight wire, it's so easy for, to hold the person's hand. And even though you're supporting some of their balance, I don't know, you're taking 80% of the responsibility, they're still getting 20% of that experience. They're getting 20% of that feedback information. They're taking 20% of the responsibility for calculating the imbalance. They are now in a process of learning. Traditional toss juggling puts a barrier there. It's saying, no, you don't get to experience any of this until you put in the time and the hard work and you learn how to do it. So that's not only like an ineffective way to learn, it's also sort of like it doesn't create a very healthy relationship, I think, with our audience. It's not a good way to make friends. It's not inclusive at all, the attitude. So let's take a look at what we can do about that. Or no, let's take a look at this idea more. So to illustrate this idea, for bicycling, we use training wheels in the support of another person. And in both of these situations, you can start to understand now the person is getting sensory feedback information from these activities. And it's that sensory feedback information that is needed to harmonize, right? Because balance requires us to harmonize with sensory feedback information, to know where my body is in space and to make adjustments and calculations. Just like juggling requires me to balance and harmonize with spatial information. So you have that condition as well. And in these situations, the key outcome is providing an environment in which the learner can collect that experience. Kids not riding the bike in these situations, right? But that's not what's important to us in this step of the learning. And then for swimming, we do the same thing. And collectively, these solutions work together to provide as much sensory access to their own experiences as part of the learning process. And this is the key takeaway now, to understand what's wrong with toss juggling, what's wrong with our classical lesson, is that it's our understanding of it and our structure for teaching it does not at all take into consideration the opportunity to collect sensory feedback information about the experience as the participant is learning. It puts all of that responsibility on them. And this is what I mean when I'm saying like it's a little bit abusive. It's not very welcoming. It's like, you got to learn this. Figure it out. Good luck. So to summarize these failures, to put it, to really drive these points home, or to simplify them as well in the process, is that juggling is not its action. Juggling is not its action, number one. Let's get that into our heads right now. And then the second thing is that juggling does not begin at the 3-ball tossing cascade. There is absolutely no reason we need to do this. We all know that juggling begins well before this. There's many jugglers who work with one object, and then if you take away the objects, then you have dance. So it's just one continuous spectrum. So it's there. We don't need to do the 3-ball tossing cascade as the first step. And then if we in defining it this way, linear scaffolding, if we do define it that way, then linear scaffolding is definitely not going to be the right solution for teaching, because it lacks sensory feedback information. So it's important to understand and even apply this like cross-disciplinary, because I know we have a lot of different teachers of different disciplines here. Whatever you're doing, this is true. Whatever you are doing, is that if there's not an opportunity, like evaluate your activities now. Like look at the learning process, like and ask yourself, is that person getting a continuous sensory feedback information from this learning process, or are they not? Like unicycle, for example, another great example. If you had your students go into the center of the room and try to free mount and learn to ride that way, it'd be very hard and very difficult. But if you let them go next to a wall and then they can start to get sensory feedback information about the experience, well, then the learning process is natural. So it's recognizing these moments in our learning structure when the learning process lacks experience, and then having a conversation about what we should do um, to reintroduce that experience and to provide safety. So just to imagine how difficult and dangerous it would be if everyone had to try to learn to swim or ride a bicycle without the use of adaptive training tools or cooperation of another person, right? Imagine a world where training wheels didn't exist, flotation devices didn't exist. Everyone who ever learned how to ride a bicycle did it on their own in open space, and the same thing for swimming. In this world, far fewer people would be able to overcome the barriers of this learning obstacle. And those who did, the few people who managed to overcome those obstacles, would have only done so by risking their physical safety and by their physical and emotional safety, right? In the process, this is what I mean by like we would understand it to be abusive, right? If I took a 6-year-old kid who didn't know how to swim and I threw them into a deep end of a swimming pool and just started saying, "Hey, kick your arms, flap your legs," that would be abuse, right? And if I put a child on a bicycle and sent them down a hill without them knowing how to ride a bicycle, we would also consider that to be abusive. This is essentially what we are doing when we ask people to start juggling with a 3-ball tossing cascade, and we use a 3-step scaffolded model to do that. You're throwing a kid in the deep end, you're sending a kid down a hill. That's the reality. And anyone who learns to juggle using this model only does so because of their own perseverance, because of their own resistance or resilience. And that's going to depend on who you're working with. One of you guys said you're working a lot with difficult kids with emotional issues. If you're working with those type of kids, that learning model is definitely not going to be effective. It's just going to turn them away. We have to be more aware and cautious of the risk that is involved in learning. And in bicycling and swimming, we understand it's physical. So it's not physical in juggling, but there's always a risk in learning. So we need to be reflective of what that risk is with juggling, because it's emotional. This is the risk in juggling, right? The point here is that this is neither a healthy nor constructive way to develop any learning capacity, right? We wouldn't do it for bicycling or swimming. We shouldn't do it for juggling. Cool. I need to take a quick break. I've been talking a lot. So now we're going to look at this alternative model. So you're going to want to have your balls and your rings nearby. And this is a lesson plan that I developed, trying to address the issue of teaching the 3-ball tossing cascade lesson. Because at the time, this was earlier, much earlier, around the same time that I started to create these functional juggling ideas. But I was teaching in a school. I was teaching 3-ball tossing juggling lessons, 15 times a week to different groups of people, and I was using the classical model, and it just was I had to use so much energy, because I had high expectations. Like I really want my students to learn, and using the classical model to get even like us, have a small amount of success, you have to put a lot of energy into that lesson plan as well, because the students aren't getting experience. They're not getting feedback experience. So, they're not really learning. So I just run around the room, trying to explain things to people. And by the end of those classes, I'd be exhausted. So I started to look for a better way. Whereas I started to understand juggling and develop, this thing about it being more about its relationships, being more of a cognitive task than a physical task. That also helped me design this lesson plan. But this lesson plan is not sort of something you need to learn to imitate or copy. We're using it as an example here. We're using it to try to apply this conversation to say, okay, if the technical approach to understanding juggling is failing, what are some ways that we can start to apply other values instead, and what are the impacts that has on the learning process of this classical teaching lesson of the 3-ball cascade? So it's intended to be as a model for you. So if you like this material, you can start to begin to apply it right away. There are many people who follow, more or less the general structure of this lesson plan because it is very effective and there was a lot of thought put into it. But as I'm presenting it to you, be aware that it's intended like everything. It's a template. Like make it your own and add your own material as you like. So, although this activity, the three ball toss and cascade, is not recognized as the start point, it is important that we enhance upon its teaching methods if we are going to be inclusive. So, it's going to take us a lot longer to change this cultural understanding that the three ball tossing cascade is not the start point of juggling. We can do it, but it's going to take us a lot more time. In the meantime, we need to improve upon our existing teaching methods for that particular lesson plan because that's the lesson plan that the most amount of people in the world are being exposed to. So we need to improve upon that lesson plan immediately because the existing lesson plan is causing a lot of majority of the people who attempt to juggle to have a pretty negative learning experience because it's a negative model of learning. So you have all these people being exposed to this classical model of juggling, finding out that it's really difficult to learn, and then walking away and saying juggling's impossible. You know, they're not going to come back. So we need to do something about that ASAP. And we're going to really be looking at how this lesson essentially it asks that question. Okay, the solution for bicycling and swimming was to reduce the level of risk involved in learning and to provide experience. So here we're going to be looking at the same thing, prioritizing safety and experience-based learning opportunities, looking for how we are going to reduce the emotional risk of the learning process, emphasizing this constantly, and then how we are going to try to provide as much feedback experience as part of that learning process as we can. We can't do it all because it's the three ball toss and cascade, right? But we can make an impact. We can improve upon this lesson, and then for anyone else afterwards, we're going to open up this whole other world of functional juggling apparatus that are going to allow us to make it accessible for anyone. So anyone this doesn't work for, then we can just change our meaning. We can change our understanding of juggling, and then we can be more abstract with it, and everyone will get it. So to start with, to take a look a little bit more at this classical model and what's so wrong about it, or its structure, because I get people who tell me too, "Oh, that's not how I teach," or I use this step and I use that step. I'm not arguing that everyone here has great teaching methods. Like I believe you do. I'm saying within this model of teaching, all of that energy is going to waste. So it's not about like changing your way, your approach. Um, it's about evaluating the model, not your necessarily individual steps. So the classical model of teaching the three ball tossing cascade uses linear scaffolded method, which does not allow for experiential learning as part of its own development. This is going to create high levels of stress and reduce an individual's motivation to withstand the emotional consequences of failure over extended periods of time. And I'm sure if you've ever taught a toss juggling lesson, you observe at the beginning of the class, people are trying more often. And the longer they continue to fail and not have success, they begin to take more time between their tries. They lose motivation and they give up. Um, and it's because we're not presenting it to them in a way where they can feel any sense of success, they can feel any sense of achievement. It's a lesson plan that is really designed to make people feel shitty about themselves. um, if the risk of learning to bicycle or swim are those of physical injury, then the risk of learning to juggle is that of emotion. So there's no physical risk in juggling, in learning to toss juggle, but there's a risk in every learning experience. And in the case of juggling, it is this expectation of performance. A lot of people are intimidated by this idea of toss juggling. It's not something people tend to think they're able to do. Like if someone doesn't know how to juggle now, they're not like walking down the street thinking like, I could probably juggle, right? A lot of people have this preconception of it, and that preconception has been reinforced by our really bad teaching models, right? Because we have such a low success rate. So I don't blame the public. I don't blame society for thinking juggling is inaccessible. So we understand that there's that cultural understanding that juggling is something that people with talent do. So any learning process is going to be emotionally challenging anyway. Anytime you take someone outside their comfort zone, it's going to be emotionally challenging. And then you're taking them outside their comfort zone and asking them to do something the majority of society doesn't believe they can do. So we need to be very aware of this. I found that the more attention I put into my class about not creating expectation, about really encouraging the person to embrace the learning process itself as opposed to emphasizing its outcome. These are all things that have helped the lesson plan enhance dramatically in terms of the success rates and also how much energy I have to use to achieve those success rates. So I'm using less energy and I'm getting better results. And it's not because I'm focusing on technical outcomes. It's because I'm focusing on providing a safe learning environment. So underestimation or lack of attention to the social and emotional learning needs of students leads to higher rates of failure and lack of desire to want to return. So it's going to be really important that we emphasize self confidence, like self motivation, achievement. You know, the classical model of teaching is a constant process of failure until you reach the end. Like I can throw one ball back and forth. I didn't reach my goal. I can throw two balls back and forth. I still didn't reach my goal. Maybe I learned something. Maybe you as the instructor observed that I had a progression, but me as the student, I'm not feeling that progression. I'm not feeling that progression until I learn to juggle the three ball cascade. And then what happens when some student starts doing that before me? I see another kid doing it and it's much easier for them to learn. What is this environment encouraging this person to do? It's encouraging them to shut down. And it doesn't matter what teaching method you use. If a student isn't motivated, if they don't believe in themselves, they're not going to learn. So that's to summarize this classical model: like no attention to risk, no attention to emotional confidence, just focused on the technique, the technical structure breakdown. It's a model of learning that's designed to only assist people who already have the capacity. Um, to take a look at these outcomes. And to start with these numbers that I'm going to use here, this is based off personal observations. This isn't like official data, but I have been around a lot and I have met a lot of, worked in a lot of schools, a lot of places. And these numbers seem to be pretty consistent. And it's also consistent with like educational theories as well for learning models that focus on technique and don't focus on inclusion. In general, for any learning model that doesn't do that, you tend to find about 30% of the population will be able to have success with those types of learning models. But you're leaving out, 2/3 of the population in that way. So we need to look at enhancing the existing model so that we can get more than that. But to do a comparison here, the general structures before we get into this lesson is that the classical model is 3 steps. It has a structure. It teaches 1 ball, then 2 balls, and then 3 balls. This is pretty obvious, it seems, and it seems to go in line with our whole idea of linear scaffolding. But when we really look closely at the activity we're teaching, we see that, wait, there's no chance to experience. So this might not be the best model. The 5-step model, and the reason we call it the 5-step model is because it's a commentary on this classical model that uses only 3 steps. And the 5-step model is structured, it's intended to be structured in a non-linear way. We want to also distort the progression of learning for the person. The more present we can make them in the learning process, the less anticipation they are making about their performance, the better they will perform. So one of the ways we do this is we create this distortion in linear progression. We start with 3 objects, then we move down to 2 objects, then 1 object, and then we move back up. Inside this 5-step model of teaching exists the classical model. If you see the 3rd, 4th, and 5th step is 1 ball, 2 ball, 3 ball. So we're not changing any of that in this structure. What we're doing, because the technique still needs to be taught, we are emphasizing the emotional and the cognitive capacity to be able to juggle. That's what we are focusing on with those first 2 steps. And in doing so, we find a dramatic difference in the success rates, in the estimated success rates for our students. So having taught thousands of juggling lessons around the world to first-time students, I found that using the classical model, even with a lot of energy, 20 to 30% of the students will have success by the end of that class, that 40 or 60-minute class period. About 20 to 30% of my students, I'm having a really good day, maybe 40% if I'm having a really good day. Whereas the estimated success rate for the 5-step model is much higher at 80% or more. For me, it's about it's been 100% for a while, but that's going to depend on how you apply it, because so much of it depends on how your students are processing the learning experience emotionally. So it's more like a performance, this lesson plan. I use a lot of clown technique constantly. I'm always clowning. I'm not really, I try not to be focused as an instructor. I tend to be more like an instigator of learning. So another thing to understand about these outcomes is that it is a low outcome. 20 to 30% is very low, but in addition to being a low outcome, we also observe sort of internationally a gender bias in that learning model as well. Like I would consistently find that the classical learning model, if a person did get it, they were probably male, or they probably identified as male, right? It was not a learning model that was gender inclusive. And I think this has to do because of its lack of social opportunity. This classical learning model is very individualized. There's not a lot of opportunity for share, and there's not a lot of opportunity for socialization. And anytime we can make the learning process social, we will neutralize its outcomes, because all human beings are social. We do have in society different gender preferences for different learning styles. And, we have the theory of multiple intelligences as well. So there's never going to be one learning style that is inclusive for everyone. But for sure as hell, we can improve upon the neutrality of the juggling lesson plan. And this is something I observe, and everyone who begins to practice this lesson plan observes as well. And we're going to talk about other things we can try to do in this lesson and other in all of our educational modeling to help continue to encourage neutrality in learning outcomes for all of our students. And then the key thing, the biggest factor here is that with the three-step model, is that the likelihood of return. If when I used to introduce the classical model of teaching, and then I had a student with me for a 12-week semester, and that after that first juggling lesson, they never want to come back. And this is especially true if you're working with sensitive populations, people with trauma. They don't like failure. They don't like to be reminded that they're not good at things. Like the whole world is telling them that they're worthless. Like we don't need to encourage that thought pattern. So if we create a learning plan that only causes them to fail, again, we're being abusive, and they're not going to return. People aren't going to come back to an activity that doesn't make them feel good unless you force them to. Whereas in the 5-step model, because we really throw that expectation of the 3-ball cascade out the window, like you don't even realize you're learning to juggle. So much of the emphasis is on play, that even and each step of the way is its own conclusion. Each step of the way provides its own sense of closure and development. So the person's not waiting until the end. Sometimes I break this lesson plan up and I give it one step at a time each day. Because you can expand upon the material. And because we make it play-based, because we make it play-focused and not technique, no one gets intimidated, no one feels like they're not good enough, and everyone wants to come back and try again, because nobody failed in this model. Even if you don't make it to the end, you don't fail in this model. So removing failure, right? Because the risk, the emotional risk here is failure. How much resilience to failure do I have? And that's going to depend on each person's personality. And their previous experiences and their capacities. If I'm a highly motivated person who likes challenge, then I'm going to have no problem with the 3-step model. But if I come from a broken home and no one ever really gave me that type of confidence, then that classical model isn't going to work for me. I'm going to go find something else that I can get more instant gratification from. So we need to include that sort of instant gratification into our learning model. And that's a good thing. Instant gratification is a good thing. It makes people feel good about themselves. Especially if that instant gratification is attached to them accomplishing a new goal, a new skill, right? That's the best type of instant gratification. Because that type of chemical reaction in the brain is going to condition positive association with the activity. So whenever we can make something fun, we create positive association. If we make learning not fun, we create negative association. So we're going to begin with the steps right now. You can get your beanbags and ring ready. Let me take a 2-minute break just to use the restroom and come right back, because it's a lot. 1 second. How are we doing on time? 2:30. Nice. Good timing. Good timing. We're not going to go over the 3 hours for sure. I promise. Okay, so I can't see you guys right now because I'm presented, but if you get your ring and your ring and your 3 balls ready, I'd like you to follow along. We're not going to actually stop to do this, but I want you to follow along, because it's nice to have the experiences and talk about them and like why we're using them and why they're effective. So if you're having those experiences at the same time, it's going to help reinforce the learning process for you. But we're not going to be stopping to do like an activity, right? And I can't see you, so I'm just assuming you guys are all doing that. So step one, we're going to start with step one, and again, it's really the first. We're proposing to add two steps prior to the classical model of learning. We are really only adding two steps, and we are also emphasizing the changing of the focus for the learning process from being technical to emotional, emphasizing the emotional learning process and the emotional experience, because that's what's going to secure, what's going to ensure that the person will learn. So to begin with, I call the first step, I have a phrase for this, I call concepts before components. So the thing about the classical juggling lesson is it starts with components, and then you build up to the concept of the cascade, right? And for me, and when I reflect back on my own personal learning process around age 9, is that made it really confusing for me to learn. Once I understood the cascade pattern, then everything else, the components made more sense. So it's just a different way to learn. I found this for me, for many subjects, it can be helpful to do it this way, to give a picture, an understanding of what is the thing we are going to be doing first. If you have a picture of something, then as you're learning its components, those components are more relevant, right? So we want to start off with the experience of the cascade. We don't want to make the cascade experience the outcome of our learning. We want it to be the first step of our learning. And it's very easy to achieve this goal by taking out the throw and just working on the sequence and behavior. So the intentions or the goals here for the first step is to condition the behavior of the cascade sequence in the absence of technical challenge. So we talked about removing the need to harmonize with objects that are moving through space. That's a big part of the challenge. Let's separate that at first. We don't need that part. So let's just work on sequencing these events. What is the sequence? What is the order of the events? Because the more I repeat this, because the second goal is time on task and repetition, because we want to create this connectivity. We want to create these new pathways in the brain, and we can do that by repeating certain behaviors. We have to repeat those behaviors a lot, but if we're creative, we can get people to do that. And another big component of this first step is to build confidence and reduce anxiety through constant sense of success, narrative influence as opposed to technical instruction. So a big thing about this lesson plan is we really avoid at all times using the word throw, using the word catch. We prefer not to use technical instruction. We prefer to use storytelling and narrative, ways of influencing or giving suggestions to people as opposed to telling them what to do. Because when you tell someone what to do or you give an instruction, you create an expectation. And as soon as you create an expectation and the person becomes aware of that, then maybe you didn't intend it to be cause insecurity, but that's what that does. That tells the person, okay, I need to do what that person just showed me. That's the expectation. So we want to avoid creating expectations, and you're going to see that pattern of teaching strategy as well. And then the one of the critical things for the neutrality aspect, for making sure that all the different learning styles are having an equal opportunity to engage with this material, is it's really important that we provide creative space for students to explore and personalize their relationships with juggling each step of the way. We do not wait for the outcome of this lesson for students to begin to express and create with it. Anytime they have new material, they should be given an opportunity to create with that material. If you allow your students to do this every step of the way and not wait, that's a culminating experience for them. I learned a new skill. I applied that skill in a creative way that allowed me to express myself as an individual. That's inclusive. Like when you move on to the next step, it's not a continuation of that learning process. It's a new learning process. So we can secure the emotional stage each of the way by allowing people to express themselves and create. And it also helps us from the beginning establish a different relationship with the activity, not to view it as a technique, but to view it as a language, as a means for expression, because this is super lacking in our education in the 3-step model, right? And in a lot of our institutions for juggling. You have a lot of really talented jugglers, very high level jugglers, can do amazing tricks, but they're not able to tell a story with their juggling. They're not able to express themselves with their juggling. They're only able to do tricks. And that's because we encourage this sort of, you have to train, and then you express. We say, no. Now we say, we express on day one. Day one, we express. Day one, we do the sequence of the cascade. So to get ready, you're going to need, let's play it now. You're going to need to have your balls and your ring, and you want to place one ball on each side of the ring, and you want to put the other ball in your hand. I'm going to explain something to you now as I'm going through about some of the teaching strategies. So a good way to introduce this lesson plan, or many lesson plans that require close attention to my body and space, is not to rely on verbal communication as much, but try to encourage visual listening. So one of the ways we do this at the beginning of the lesson is to use a mirror introduction. We apply a lot of the strategies I use come from early childhood development because they are the most universally accessible. So many of us are familiar with playing mirror games at the beginning of a circus class, especially if we're doing a circle time. You know, we play these little mirror games to get everyone focused and together. In this context, by playing a mirror game, by introducing the activity with a mirror game, like show me your beanbag hand, show me your empty hand, copy me. I know all the students are looking because I don't always know that they're listening, right? We don't know this. But if they're looking at me with their eyes, you know, they can hear me and not listen to me, right? But if they look at me with their eyes, they see me. So we want to encourage listening with eyes from the beginning. And the way we do this is we use mirror activity. Um, so I start off to encourage them to copy our behavior as well. So I say, show me your beanbag hand, show me your empty hand, show me your beanbag. And I'm also doing this because I want them to start off right away with the cascade, but explaining the cascade sequence is pretty complicated if you talk about, you know, the mathematics of it. And I say, show me both hands. And then I give a simple explanation. The empty hand likes to pick up and the beanbag hand likes to put down. Empty pick up, empty up, beanbag down. And then I'll repeat this, and I'll be doing this with my students, and I go really slow at the beginning, and I make sure everyone's doing it with me. So I'm watching. I don't have to go around to everyone. I can see everyone's doing it correctly. There might be a couple students that are not doing it correctly, but that's okay. I'm going to go and work with them individually after I demonstrate to the class. And then I encourage them to speed up and speed up and speed up. Once they've done that activity, or sometimes while I'm helping the students that are making errors, I'll tell the rest of the class to try it blindfolded or just close your eyes. And they really enjoy this. It's really sensory stimulating for the students. It's especially helpful for students who exhibit hyperactivity students because it's that visual processing. They overstimulate and they go fast and they make all this thing. If you have a hyperactive child in your class, have them do this activity with their eyes closed, and it's going to calm them down and they'll have more success as well. So those first two activities there, the idea is to introduce the sequencing relationship of the cascade pattern, right? That's what we have to first establish. In order to condition this, to create this new connectivity, we need a lot of repetition. We need massive amounts of repetition to form new neurological connections. So the thing is, though, if you just have your students sit there and do this activity over and over, it gets bored. As soon as the person has proficiency in the activity, they want another challenge, right? Or they're going to start to get bored. So what we do is we create variation. We're really focused on just conditioning the sequence and relationship. We don't care how they do it. So we use another series of activities. So we continue to encourage them to sequence this behavior and to do it in different ways, right? So now they're understanding the sequence not as a task, but as a concept they can apply, right? Very valuable. So for the shoulder juggling, we say put one in, take one out. Sometimes I'll make a joke like, oh, imagine you're on a phone call and now you have another phone call, but you don't drop the first one, right? Always looking for ways to explain these activities using storytelling, not using technical instruction. You don't need to use technical instruction. If you try to use technical instruction, you're going to confuse people. Because this is the first lesson. They don't know anything about a cascade yet, but they understand like pick one up, put one down, or take this call, catch that call, right? And armpit juggling is, again, another fun example. You can be trying this yourself. There's many variations for these activities. In general, I refer to these as body juggling activities or table juggling. And the idea is we're still sequencing. We have an anti-entropic sequence of orbital events. The only difference is they're not being harmonized by space-time because I'm not having to interact with that motion through space. This is what we refer to as static interactions with juggling. And then I use the elbows. And you can come up with more variations of this. The idea is every time the person sequences the activity, we are encouraging that pathway of communication in their brain to become stimulated. The more often that pathway is stimulated, the stronger the connectivity becomes. So later on, when we ask them to increase the complexity of their motor control, right, of their expression with throws and catches, we know they have the foundation of connectivity. So we're really just adjusting the expression later on. One of the most common errors we see at this first step, you're going to see a video in the video now, is passing between hands. It's the same error we see when we ask people to juggle two balls for the first time, right? The students will pass between their hands, right? This is because there's a dominant side to their brain. And the dominant side of their brain wants to be doing more of the processing than the non-dominant side. If you try to make this correction, if you try to make this correction when the people are tossing, it's very difficult. I have to explain to the person, oh, you're throwing it wrong. Don't pass underneath. And I have to hope that they listen to me and that they make that correction, right? It's a lot of hoping and it doesn't always go well. It takes a long time too. So rather than wait for that moment in the lesson plan when we know they're going to make that mistake, we can correct that mistake now, or reduce the potential for them to make that mistake by conditioning the behavior here first when it's static on the table. Um, what you're going to see here is the strategy that we use is we don't give instruction. Whenever a person's making a mistake with juggling, there's only going to be so many possible solutions because of its structure, right? So what we encourage facilitators to do in these moments is to not to correct, not to instruct the behavior, but to provide an opportunity. So this is prevention. So I'm not going to give an explanation. I see the bad behavior. What I'm going to do instead is I am going to contact their ball. So I put my hand over her ball so she cannot pass between her hands. And when you do this, people will try to bring the ball together. Your job, just keep them from doing that and to be patient and wait. Because after they're not able to bring their hands together, they're going to look for something else. And that something else is pretty obvious. So just by stopping them from making the mistake and giving them an opportunity to solve the problem themselves, people make the correction. And because that solution came from their own brain, it becomes more permanent, faster, right? It's a different learning process than me explaining to them. You know, it could be that I could have explained it and it would have went just as fast, but it's much healthier. It's a much more impactful learning process if these ideas are being germinated from the participant themselves, right? As opposed to regurgitated. What you'll observe too, or something sensory, just to make a note here, or sometimes if the person's really confused, I'll use gesture. I'll point to the ball for them. But the important thing to understand is to let the person figure it out for themselves. So anyone who's making a mistake at the beginning, maybe if I have a class of 30 people, it's going to be half the class, maybe a little bit less, is going to pass between their hands. And I just spend 30, 60 seconds with each person. I stop them from making the mistake. I allow them to find the solution, and then they don't repeat the mistake anymore. Whereas if I correct for them, they'll fix it while I'm there. I'll go away and they'll start making the mistake again, you know? So that's the thing to understand about step one. And these are the steps here. Let's go back a little bit. You don't have to follow all the same steps, but they are there for you. And then the idea is after I've gone through a few of these activities, I've given some examples. The students, they don't understand the laws of this activity. They don't understand the rules or structure of this game, but it's so consistent, right, that everyone does it intuitively now. And they're all able to figure out these patterns. And usually before I even suggest for students to be creative, I'll have students who come up to me or call out to me that, oh, look at me, look what I can do, look what I figured out. And they're using a different part of their body, but they're doing the same sequence and behavior. They're sequencing the cascade, but using different parts of their body. And they can work with different objects and play these games as well. You can pass these patterns. If you have two people facing each other, 3 balls, I can pass to you and put in your hand and you can put it into my hand. Then it becomes more social as well. What we need to do is condition the sequence and relationship. That's our primary goal here. And allowing them to be creative with it as well is really helpful. So I'll talk about that now. So as soon as they finish this step, I would encourage them to create with their own ideas. Rings are very helpful because rings are great. When you start to work with rings, you can put them on your body, and you can even start to design like conditioning exercises with this. I would often we'd start off on the ground, like with our butts on the ground, and we use our legs. So I'm putting them on my feet and taking them off my feet. It's such a good ab workout, and all the kids are laughing and they think they're juggling, but really I'm conditioning their core strength. So there's ways to be creative with it like that, but it's important that you allow your students to understand that they have that power to create with. It really changes their relationship. It's such a small thing. They only need 5 minutes. It's easy to create with, but it's that process of creation that transforms their relationship with the learning. So once students demonstrate an understanding of any new skill, opportunity to create and express should always be provided. This produces a personal relationship with the activity and leads to a greater sense of self-motivation and interest from everyone involved because it's personalized now. I create with juggling. So that's something I want to keep doing. I want to develop that. So we're increasing the motivation by giving them this opportunity as well. Some students will pursue these experiences without instruction, whereas others may need additional guidance or encouragement to get started. So it might happen naturally, or you could encourage it as well, but always allow for creativity. Ooh, so that's step one. Am I covering everything? I think I got it all. Okay. So now for step two, So the first step was to condition the sequence in relationship with space and time, because that is the relationship that's determining the flow of information in my brain, right? Just like whether I'm bounce juggling or tossing clubs, the flow of information is the same. So in step one, what we've done is we've allowed the person to get some sensory experience of this sequence, right? They were juggling already. And then in addition to that, they learned a lot of different tricks in the process and created their own. So think about the impacts there psychologically for the student. For step two, we're going to be focusing on sensory sequencing of time. So that last part of the first part of the lesson plan, we're focused on the anti-entropic sequence of orbital events, sequencing. Now we need to focus on the harmonization. And we're gonna break down the science of what it is that we're actually harmonizing with more later on in the course. But for today's lesson, it's important to understand that what it ultimately, in order for if the person has the sequence in relationship, the next thing they need to do is be able to process an external sense of time in relationship to the movement of the objects they're interacting with. So every time I throw that object into the air, there's a certain amount of time I have until I have to interact with it again. Beginner jugglers, their bodies don't have a sense of awareness of this time. They throw the ball up in the air and they don't know how much time they have, so they panic and they move faster than they need to, and they don't give themselves time to process because they don't know. They're just trying to go as fast as they can and their system collapses. So developing this sensory awareness of time is the next goal of this next sequence. We're also continuing to develop sequencing relationships very strongly. We're developing all those sequencing capacities. We're continuing down that path. But really here it's about helping them strengthen that sensory communication part of the formula. So the step two is going to promote bilateral sequencing capacities and develop sensory integrated awareness of time. As always, emphasize and build confidence and reduce anxiety through constant sense of success and narrative influences, as opposed to technical instruction. So step two is where we really focus on narrative play, narrative instruction, because it's all storytelling. We never tell the people to throw. We never tell them to catch. We never explain anything really. We just create an environment to play. So create a state of play in which mistakes are unnoticed and the desire to learn and feel successful outweighs that of fear. Because the barrier I find is when people start to feel intimidated by juggling, when they start to feel unsuccessful in that learning process, I see them try less. And I see them look at their peers more. I see them look at other people, and I see them, I don't see a lot of positive energy in their bodies. I see a lot of negative energy in the classical learning model. So what I really strive for in this lesson is to create an environment of play, to take all that pressure away, because the pressure is really the thing that stops people. Taking a look at this now, you're going to need a ring and one ball. Should be played. So narrative intro. For all these exercises, I'm going to use a story. I start off by saying, show me your face inside of the ring. Now it's not a ring. Now it's a moon. And I want to see what color is your moon. So I get everyone to look at each other and put their faces inside a circle. And I say, now show me your beanbag. And now it's not a beanbag. Now it's a cow. And the cow, I ask, can your cow jumps over the moon? I say, my cow likes to jump over my moon. Can your cow jump over your moon? Cow jumps over the moon. Very good. We are going to continue with this narrative play now. That establishes the whole foundation for it. But to begin with, just to make a comparison quickly, is what would be the other way to explain that activity? Imagine I'm telling people to throw for cows to jump over moons. If you didn't explain it that way, how else would you explain it, right? Ask yourself that question. You would have to say, hold your ring up here, hold your beanbag down here. Then I want you to throw your beanbag over the ring. When it gets to the top, I want you to pass the ring into the other hand and then try to catch the ball before it hits the ground. That's a lot of freaking information. It's really confusing. Or you could just ask someone to see if their cow jumps over their moon. Cow jumps over the moon works better. So then we want to continue to condition the relationship, right? There's this pattern of everything that we do. We're always looking for ways to get them to condition the same relationships, but to do it with variations so they feel like they're gaining more material, right? And it's also helpful if I can apply a capacity in multiple situations, then it's transferable. Teaching them to do one thing in one situation isn't really transferable. It's good for developing that one task. So then we say, okay, now the cow jumps through the moon. And it's the same sequence as before. So and then every time they throw, they're learning how much time they have to process, to sequence their relationship. And then at some point we say, okay, now we put the cow inside the moon and now it's a barn. And I ask them a question. I say, can you show me if your barn door works? Like, this is how the door works. Does your door work? And I get everyone to practice that movement without telling them to. And then I say for the cow to get out, it has to jump. And for the cow to go home, it has to jump so I can close the door. And then it's just jump, open, jump, close, jump, open, jump, close, and practice on both sides. So after they do it on one side, I have them do it on the other. And then we put it all together. And this is the sequence that lets me know they are ready to start toss juggling. Because once they're able to do this, I know that they have a sense of timing that allows them to sequence asynchronous bilateral movements underneath their relationship with the toss. So their sense of time of that toss is so strong that they're able to sequence these other activities as well. So it's jump, open, jump, close, or jump, switch down. And this is a really complicated movement at the beginning. So this is why I break it down first. I say, hey, let's make sure our door works. So it's arm, hand, arm, hand, arm, hand. If you break down the sequence and steps separately, it's really easy, because then all you have to do is add the throw. And all of these activities, they're complex movements that would normally be pretty hard to explain to people. And if you tried to explain to them in technical ways, you're going to create anxiety and expectation, right? By presenting it in this way, everyone's able to understand, and we don't create expectation or anxiety. In fact, we create the opposite. We create a sense of play. Because if I compare the behavior of my students in this learning model versus the classical, here everyone is interacting. It's a very social environment. It's hilarious when the cow falls on the floor. It's not a negative reflection of me. I don't see the drop in causing insecurity. I see the drops can be a source of joy for my students as well, because it's just cows and moons. It doesn't make any sense. And when their friend drops, it's funny, and they laugh at each other. I see collective laughter at shared failure. That's a healthy learning environment. Whereas in the classical model, we don't see that, because I'm telling you, you have to do this and you have to do that. And everyone's comparing themselves to each other. And I see so much insecurity and space in between my students. This is such a positive way to learn, by using storytelling. And it's actually easier for people to understand these ideas. If you want to look at the steps again, and there are videos for this online, and then also all of these slides are available. You'll have a link for all of these slides with video attachments as well for the future when you want to go back. Something I'll emphasize is that you don't have to use this story. This is the story I've been using for a long time. It comes from a children's nursery rhyme that isn't well known in all parts of the world. And at first I thought that would mean it wouldn't be international. Like, oh, this story is only going to work when I work in these cultures who are aware of this nursery rhyme. But what I found out is that people don't care. Nobody cares. Doesn't make a difference, because there's no reason cows should be jumping over moons anyway. So the story has no cultural relevance. The idea is to take the emphasis away from the technique, not to get the person to think, what are the steps, but to look at me, to use their brain and their mind to visualize something and do it themselves, right? That's how learning should occur. And that's what we're doing here. By not giving them the instruction, we're giving them the opportunity. They have to form these solutions themselves. And that's why it's working so much better as well. But so the steps you can review, the basic one is, at first I make the cow jump over the moon. And this is getting them to learn to sequence the timing of the ball, to respond to the timing of the ball, and to make their movements underneath, and to do it in both directions as well. And then when the cow jumps through the moon, I'm conditioning the same sequence in relationship, but now I'm asking them to throw through the moon to create more variation, and to encourage movement of the elbows, because we really want to activate that particular joint. And then we have them stick it inside the moon. And here now you're doing a column throw. It's not a cross and throw. But the key thing is, you're working with negative space as well. So the thing is to develop the relationship of time with the tossing of the object. If the person can make this sequence, they have a sense of the object's timing, right? They have a strong sense of the object's timing, because they're interacting with that motion. And you'll observe it as well. What's beautiful about these activities is there's always an empty beat. There's a pause. They do it, and then there's a moment for them to process. They can process, and they can try again. And what you observe is, as the students begin, there'll be a break, a gap between that. They'll do, then they'll process, then they'll do. And the more they do, they start to fill in that empty beat with their own rhythm. They impose the sense of time. So they start to do it in a rhythm. Boom, 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 boom. It happens naturally. That's another indication that they are learning to really process the sense of time from space, when they start to show they're doing the pattern with a self-imposed rhythm. If they start to do these activities with a self-imposed rhythm, I know they are processing that relationship with time. When there's a gap in between each trick, they're still working to develop that sensory awareness. But here on that last task, that lets me know that they can, underneath their sense of awareness of time from the one throw, they can sequence really complex bilateral alternation movements, which is what they're going to need to do if they're going to toss juggle a 3-ball cascade. And then in the previous step, I made sure that their bodies and their brains were conditioned with this sequence. So their bodies know the sequence of the three object cascade. The only thing now they need to do is learn how to process that sensory wise in space. So we have, with these first 2 steps, we established that. We created the relationship with the sequence, and we created the relationship with the sensory information. Both goals are accomplished. We are now ready to ask our students to begin to learn to toss juggle. Prior to establishing both of those conditions, if I ask my student to learn to toss juggle, I'm asking them to fail because I didn't make sure that they were ready for that. But if every student that can do this last activity, I know they have the sequencing capacity, right? And I know they have a comprehension of what the pattern is. So when we go on to the next step, our students they're secure, they're safe. We did our job. In terms of correcting errors for this process, it's the same idea. We don't want to give solutions. We don't want to give instructions. We want to give opportunities. So the best way to do that, anytime someone's having trouble with this activity, it's because they don't have enough time to process. So you have to give them time to process first because they need to experience the sequence. So the first thing you can do is shadow juggle. Catch the ball for them, place it in their hand, and then drop it. When I catch the ball, I wait. A lot of times people will just stare at the ball and not do anything. And then maybe I'll gesture to their hands and then they'll work out the sequence. Give them the opportunity to do the sequence on their own and then condition, let them get repetition. Every time they do it, even though it's slow, even though it doesn't have sensory feedback, they're still conditioned in the sequence and behavior. So then in one moment, usually after I pick up the tempo, and then I usually don't even tell them, I just don't catch it for them and they catch it themselves, is the idea of this correction strategy. And that works for any step of the way. The person just needs time to process the sequence, and then we reduce the time, and then they learn to do it. So I don't think I need to show that. I think it was I need to show this part. Where am I? This. And this works for every part of the pattern. I find that in this first step, usually there's like a couple people that need a little bit of help, and then with the last pattern as well. Or with the first pattern, when they throw the cow over the moon, some people are a little bit, slow to get started, and you might need to do this with some of them. And then on this last step, there's usually a couple people that need a little bit of help because this is a complicated level of sequencing. But all it takes is a little bit of time to just stop the ball, give them the time they need to process, and be patient. Let them find the solution. Don't be so eager to tell them what to do, because as we start to understand juggling more and more, we're going to start to realize that it's this really universal process. It's something that, like, a lot of its information is built into our biology already. Like walking, right, follows the same sequence and pattern. Human beings are very familiar with these relationships. They're just not familiar with it in this sensory context. So it's the learning strategy as you apply these more and more, you become more aware of this. It's really about being patient. Like, it's about understanding what the experience is that the person needs to have, and then just facilitating that experience for them and letting them determine their rate of progression. If we do that, then we get everyone. And you guys I can't see you, but I'm assuming you were practicing those with me, so that you could have a sensation of what they were like. So that's it. Those are the only 2 steps that I'm suggesting. From this point forward, you are free to go back to whatever classical model you have of how to teach that 1 ball, 2 ball, 3-step model, because linear scaffolding is valuable, and we do have to teach the technique of juggling, and that's what that portion of the lesson plan is there for. So we have 3 steps at the end for teaching 1 ball, 2 ball, and 3 ball, but these steps go much faster now because we've already developed the primary capacities that the person needs. We prepared them for the activity before they did it. Just like if you could somehow prepare someone to know how to swim before you put them in the water. This is essentially what we are trying to do. It's not possible to do that, but we're doing that as much as we can. And I want to take a moment now, just looking at these first 2 steps before we get into now reintroducing the classical model. What is the difference in the experience of this learning model for a student that participates in each of these lesson plans? Let's just do a moment to just sort of put it into perspective, because hopefully that'll help us understand why this lesson plan is being more successful than the other one. So in the classical model, at the end of the first step, the student is able to throw and catch 1 ball. Classical model juggling, I finish step 1, I can do this. I can tell you, look at me, I can do this. Am I juggling? I don't know. I'm throwing a ball back and forth. Sometimes I clap my hands underneath or I tap my body, right? This is the level of accomplishment that the student has. They haven't reached their goal yet. They don't feel like they've reached their goal yet because their goal is to do a 3-ball toss and cascade. So they don't actually have a sense of achievement yet. Whereas in the 5-step model, the first lesson plan, they get so many variations because each variation of that trick personally feels to them is another hit of dopamine. It's another example of, hey, I did this well. And the more examples they have of I did this well, the more dopamine they have, the more positive association they create with the experience and the activity. Because by the end of step 1 in the 5-step model, they can say, hey, look, I can juggle on the table. I can juggle with my eyes closed. I can juggle on my shoulders. I can juggle with my elbows. And I can make new forms of juggling that nobody showed me before because I'm a creative person. They can say all of that about themselves after the first step of juggling. Not to mention that we also serve this really helpful purpose of conditioning their sequencing relationship, of developing that pathway, of exposing them to the pathway of communication that they're going to need to interact with in order to perform this task. So we accomplished all of that. And now compare that to tossing and catching one ball back and forth. And then now on step 2, it keeps going down this path of comparison where like you have at step 2, it's a completely different activity now. This is where people start to get challenged, right? It's when they start to pass underneath. It's when they start to experience more failure. So step 2, if I did it right, if I managed to succeed, I'm able to toss 2 balls back and forth in an asynchronous pattern bilaterally, similar to the cascade, but not the same experience, right? That's what I can tell you I do. Whereas in the second step of the 5-step model, we use all these variations. It's a site swap pattern called 3-1-2. With the balls, it looks like this. It's one ball always goes up and one ball always gets passed underneath. You can make it an active 2 as well, and you can make if you don't site swap. I don't think anyone here is a site swap person. Don't worry about it. Not important. It's a particular pattern, and what's interesting about it is it's a very useful pattern to us. You're going to see it come up a lot in our material because it only requires 2 objects to do this sequence. So it's the pattern that allows for the most like bilateral sequence in development with the least amount of objects. There's a lot of really interesting things that this really simple pattern of throwing one object up and passing it underneath, right? Normally that's the error we want to avoid. But in this situation, because we make that behavior reflective, meaning they do it in both directions, it's beneficial. If they only do it in one direction, it doesn't help us. But because they do it in both directions, it balances out. It's developing them more. But by the end of this step, emotionally, how does the student feel? The student feels like I can make my cow jump over the moon. I can make my cow jump through the moon. I can make my cow jump between barns. And I can create new tricks because always by the end of this, there's some kid in the class, some hyperactive boy that comes up to me and says, "Look what I figured out. I can do this. Have you ever seen this before?" And I say, "No, I've never seen that before. That's amazing. Keep being creative." What is that relationship that child is having with the juggling? How motivated do the students in the 5-step model feel right now? I'm about to ask them to just in the next step to start to experience the real traditional failure of learning to juggle with the classical approach. That's what I'm going to ask them to do next. But going into that experience, how does that person feel compared to the person who's been experiencing the classical model? Completely different. I observe in my classroom completely different levels of confidence, completely different levels of success. When I use the classical model, I hear a lot of apologies from my students when they drop the balls. I always found this to be really sort of fascinating. That when you teach people to juggle, they apologize constantly. Every time they make a mistake, they apologize. And in the 5-step model, I don't hear apologies. I hear laughter. And that is having a massive effect on the quality of learning. Because we're emphasizing the experience as it should be in life. We should always be emphasizing the experience. We don't learn things, because we have to. We learn things because we enjoy to be alive, right? And it's fun. So that's the idea. And just to put it in perspective, like just how toxic that classical model of learning is. It doesn't provide any of these considerations. It just says you need to learn this, and these are the steps, and figure it out. Whereas this 5-step model, we're creating such a much more positive learning environment, and it's that positivity that is really shifting the outcomes. The steps themselves are very useful, and if you just apply those 2 steps before your traditional learning model, you're going to see an immediate increase in success rates because those first 2 steps are addressing so many of the problems that we would normally see. And then by the time I get to the classical model, there's less people making errors. So me as a facilitator, I'm able to use more of my time with a smaller group of people. So anyone who is having a challenge, I spend more time with them now. I focus my resource where it needs to be. Because everyone else is playing and having fun. I don't need to be with them. So in terms of outcomes, the classical model at the end of step 2 provides us with 2 learning outcomes. I can toss 1 ball back and forth. I can toss 2 balls back and forth. The 5-step model provides 10 more outcomes of different tricks that a student feels, even if I stop at this point, they're going home. All of the students are going home feeling awesome. If you stop after step 2 of the classical model, no one's going home feeling awesome. 5-step model, everyone goes home feeling awesome. The result of that, the emotional stress level is much lower in the 5-step model than it is in the classical model, and social engagement is very high in the 5-step model as compared to the classical model. So that means return rates are much higher as well. I don't feel this pressure to finish the 5-step model. If we run out of time, if a student gets caught up on one step, that's cool. We can stop wherever we are. That doesn't cause them to feel they failed. That doesn't cause them to feel like they didn't reach their goal. That just causes them to feel like, okay, this is my holding spot in my learning process. Next time I'll learn more. That's what it does differently. More accomplishment, more creativity, more play, and more fun. Students' emotional levels and confidence going into the 3rd step of the 5-step model versus classical scaffolding highlights the reasoning for its success. So just as you start to use this approach too, and you'll see if you're someone who has used the classical model, it's a playful environment. It's a learning environment where people are not afraid to try and make mistakes, and that's what they need to have if they're going to learn to toss juggle the 3-ball cascade, which is why we put so much emphasis at the beginning of the learning process to develop that confidence, because we know the second half of the learning process is going to require resilience to failure. So if we cannot establish that resilience first by developing confidence, then the likelihood of our students giving up during that process is much higher. Steps 3 through 5 of the 5-step model, it just goes back to the classical. So anything you would normally do to teach, bring those back in. You're going to find that they're more impactful. You're not going to have to use as much energy to develop this portion of the lesson as well. One thing to be aware of is that we spend far less time on this portion of the lesson plan because we really developed everything we need to. Now the only thing we're working on is the technique. And in step 2, with the cow jumps over the moon, they've already gotten so many repetition of throwing 1 ball back and forth. They know the timing of it. We really already developed this. This is almost an unnecessary step. Sometimes I'll skip this step and I'll just go straight to 2 balls because you really only need to spend like 60 seconds. I tell them the key thing here is continue to avoid technical terminology. So here I like to say the hands take, or not the hands take turns. I just focus on the body. I say eyes up, hands down. It's really just, establish your body position in, get them used to this idea of throw in, add your exercises underneath, but 60 seconds, really fast. Another reason we want to start to pick up the speed of the lesson planning at this point is because this is where it becomes more clear, becomes more obvious to anyone who wasn't paying attention that now we're learning to toss juggle. In the previous steps, it's not as clear. So this is now people can become aware and I can start to see that anxiety come back during this part of the learning. So I don't want to make it longer than it has to be. I want to move fast. While they're feeling good, I want to give them the challenge. So we go through this first step really quickly. And then with 2 balls, it's the same. It's the tossing and catching of 2 balls. Here, I say the hands take turns. That's my strategy. I say, same as before, but now the hands take turns. Because I try to use language that people can relate to, that they can put into context of their own lives. So by saying the hands take turns, I find that's useful. What we don't want to see at this step is this. And this is what we typically see. If you use the classical model and you introduce 2 balls, you're going to see half your class do that. The first time they try, you're going to see half your class do that. And that's because we didn't condition for them the sequencing relationship yet. They don't know this sequencing relationship. So in the 5-step model, because we spend time conditioning that relationship first, we observe far fewer students will make this mistake. And those who do, it takes less time to correct the behavior. And once it's corrected, it remains corrected. Whereas in the classical model, it takes me much more time to correct this behavior. And then I have to correct it several times before it remains corrected, if that makes sense. So the solution for this, if anyone has a problem, is shadow juggling. Catch the balls for them. The same solution for the cow jumps over the moon sequence. Give them time, let them process, and give them reference points in space. Throw to this hand, throw to that hand. Classical solution, everybody knows it. It works faster now because they've already have that foundation. So for this one, after I introduce it, I look at my class and I see how many people are passing underneath. If I have a normal sized class of 20 students, normally it would be half the class, but now it's only 3 or 4 students that are making that mistake. So I spend all my time with those students, helping them process it. And then as soon as they got it, then the whole class moves on. So I make sure we're at 100% success rate by this point in the lesson plan. I don't move on unless I have 100% success each step of the way. So that step is really fast as well. It's when we get into that final step that I have a couple suggestions for you guys. Again, you're not required. But it's important to understand that when you get to the three balls, add in that third ball, sequence in the relationship of that third ball is actually, there's a gap there. The person hasn't developed that capacity yet. This is the first time they are experiencing it. So it can be really helpful. It's not always required, but I encourage you to have the students do a three ball flash, to just throw three balls and drop three balls. Because when you don't, the thing is that you tend to get, if the person's able to do the two balls and then you give them the third, a lot of times you get what I call the third ball shake, where they'll throw the first two balls and then they'll just shake the third ball in their hand. Like they want to do something with it, but you see they want to do something with that object, but they're having trouble processing it. It's because information is becoming overlapped, and we're asking them to sequence a higher level of challenge here. So getting them to just do a flash at the beginning is really helpful. Three throws, three drops. Another thing I like to say is you're not able to catch something you can't throw. So if the student's not throwing that third ball, don't worry about catching anything. Just get them to throw the ball. And then I encourage collections, or what some people refer to as suicide training. So I say, make three throws and three catches 3 times in a row. Then make 4 throws and 4 catches 3 times in a row. And I go all the way up till 6. It's not actually important. The reason I do this is not because I want them to actually do the exact amount of throws and the exact amount of catches that they decide to do. But the reason we tell them, I find this to be helpful, is we want to begin to, as much as possible, encourage the student to practice visualization. Visualization is going to be critical for their ability to now self-correct, to auto-correct their behaviors. And not everyone is aware of that at first. They can be overexcited and distracted by the juggling. So if I say I'm going to make 4 throws and 4 catches right now, that's going to cause me to visualize 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the behavior we want to encourage. If they make more throws or less throws, it's okay. They can continue to throw after that. They often do. They say I'm going to make 4 throws, and then they end up making 8. That's fine. The real reason here is to get them to visualize. That's the intention. And my advice, my encouragement is, if you tell people how to pick how many throws they want to do first, it's going to cause them to visualize. If they visualize, they will start to make corrections and they will develop faster. So for the 3 ball, I encourage flashing first, and then determining how many throws you want to make before you start, because that's going to encourage visualization. But again, you're free to use your own strategies here. Some additional strategies you might be familiar with, because at the end of this thing, there's always going to be a couple people who they're having trouble. It's not working out. I tend to find that because we've addressed so much of the cognitive sequencing capacity, so much of the motor control development, if a person is still struggling at the end of the lesson, it's usually something more emotional or anxiety based, right? They're not giving themselves the space that they need to process this new information. They're putting too much expectation, they're putting too much pressure, they're being overstimulated. So what's important to understand is, if the person achieved all the steps in the lesson plan thus far, they have the sequencing capacity they need, and they have the sensory processing relationship that they need. What they don't have is the independence yet, the ability to self-regulate all of that information. That's the final last step, which is why I try to encourage or share with you now. I'm not telling you how to teach that last part, but to be aware of that. If you're using the 5-step model, the only thing left is managing the stimulation itself. So what we can do in those situations is try to be understanding and try to provide opportunities where the person can experience some sensation of the cascade, but while still giving them some support, so they still feel supported. Because usually that's all they need, is just to feel supported, so they don't feel afraid, and then their brains process everything they need to process. So some classic examples here, some strategies: shadow juggling. Many of us already use it. That's a really helpful way. Just giving the person time to process, and then speeding up over time, right? Usually I start by placing the ball gently in their hand, and then I'll start to drop it. If you have an extra ball in your hand, a 4th ball, you can actually build this tempo up so that it's identical to what they're going to feel later on. But that requires a little bit faster technique. And then 2-person juggling is another great example. This helps the person sequence like the pattern on one side of their body, but it's not encouraging them to communicate that information between sides. So one thing we can do is practice this on both sides of the body, but ultimately this is going to help them more harmonize with the sense of time, to learn the frequency of the behavior, but it's not helping them develop the communication between sides. So 2-person juggling is helpful, but I find a better way to develop a person, if you're going to do the 2-person juggling, Another activity that you should add to your tool belt of think strategies you have is 5 ball ultimates, which a lot of people are surprised that that you would be doing 5 ball ultimates as part of the learning process for the Cascade, because we tend to think of this activity as being a higher level challenge than the Cascade, because it's a 5 ball passing pattern where every throw is a pass. So you're passing with both hands. Usually, when we start to introduce passing, we tend to do with one hand first, and then we introduce both. But here, we're using this as part of a really helpful learning tool, learning strategy, because what it does is it recreates the sensation of the 3 ball tossing cascade for the participant, but it allows me to make corrections for them. So it allows them to make mistakes in their throws and their timings, but I'm able to make corrections for that. That way, they're able to gain experience, sensory feedback, while I maintain the activity for them. The pattern works that one person, the student, is always going to be passing diagonal. So they always throw to the opposite hand or the same hand as me. And then I'm always going to be thrown to the outsides, lateral. So I throw to the outsides, they throw to the insides. This produces a tempo ratio of 2.5 to 3, right? They have two hands. So they're responsible out of 5 balls for 2.5% of those balls, right? In terms of tempo. So I like to say that this is the closest we can bring someone to juggling without juggling for them, right? This activity is going to provide as much sensation of the 3 ball tossing cascade as we can without doing it for them. It's a little bit confusing if you haven't seen it before, but you can do it on the floor as well, right? Where it doesn't have to be a throw. It works. One person is always throwing diagonal and alternating turns, and the other person is always throwing the outside. This is a pattern that is referred to as being non-congruent. So it means we're not doing the same things at the same time. So it's I throw, you throw, I throw, you throw. And then to show you the video again, it can be helpful there. And there, the person's able to make a lot of errors, and I'm able to correct it for them. I've also found that this can be easier for people to do with rings at the beginning. I found some students find this easier to do with rings than balls. I think it has to do with the shape, and because they don't take as much space this way, so there's more space for them. They don't collide as much, but the rings are a bit more dangerous. So be aware of that. Rings can be easier if you're teaching this pattern because they take up less space horizontally, but they can also break your nose. And then the last strategy I have, the one that people tend to find comical, is taken from this really classical idea of like hardcore, like Russian circus, like people who, I got this idea when I was training for 7 balls. A really classical idea for training 7 balls is to use a restriction to tie your arms to your body so that you're only able to use your elbows. So if you're able to juggle 5 balls, train 5 balls that way, then the idea is that's going to make your pattern so stable, and you're going to be having such efficiency of motion that when you move to 7, it's much easier. So it's a strategy that's used for high technique training as well. But we use it in this situation for a particular reason. I tend to use this if I see someone is super hyperactive, meaning they're not taking time to visualize or be reflective, or if they are a shoulder juggler, because we get this situation where we have a lot of people who say, oh, I can juggle, but only if I'm walking, only if I'm moving forward. And that's because they're throwing the object forward. And they tend to do that when they use the shoulder instead of the elbow. So getting them to send that signal to the elbow instead of the shoulder, you can tell them and explain that to people, but I find that doesn't really help. They tend to need some sort of sensory feedback to really get this idea. So by tying the elbows together, what's great about this is, and using an elastic band, you want it to be stretchy. You don't want it to be too restrictive. The Russian style is to restrict, but here the intention is not to restrict the behavior. The intention is to create a sensory feedback loop between the errors. So now if the person reaches up with their arm, automatically it's going to pull the other arm back. So it's going to give a sensory feedback, and it's going to condition. So the more they practice this way, you start to see less and less movement of the shoulders, because each error corrects the last error. So it reinforces the correct behavior. The other thing I find about this exercise, and why I say I use it with children who are hyperactive as well, who are not illustrating, that they're picking up the balls and they're trying, and they're constantly changing their position in the room, and their feet are not squared, and they're not standing upright. They're just trying and hoping they get lucky. They're not being reflective at all. Those people, I find this is helpful for as well, because what happens when you do this is when you drop, it's a lot less convenient to pick up. It takes more time. You have to actually go down on your knees like a dinosaur. And it's comical at the beginning. It can make these students feel like they're special. They get a little bit of attention, and that's fine, because after a few repetitions of that, it gets very old and it starts to become not fun. It starts to become an interruption to all that time that they were trying and failing. And then what I find that in doing this, these children who came into the activity hyperactive, I start to see them take more time before they try again, because there's a consequence, there's an inconvenience to drop in now. So they put all that energy in picking up the balls, and then I see them take a breath, and I see them look up, and then I see them try. So the two outcomes of using this strategy is it's going to help give sensory feedback to encourage people to use their elbows if they're using their shoulders too much. And it's going to really encourage people who are hyperactive to be more reflective about their behaviors and start to visualize as well. So those are the closing strategies I have for you. Again, these last four strategies, most of them are common, um, but it's just the collection of them and talking about how we should use them and why, just to sort of give you guys some directions. If you want to, you can take, you can leave. It's up to you. Cool. So to summarize the key concepts of this lesson plan, the whole idea is to emphasize, to recognize what the risk is, right? From the beginning, to make the comparison with bicycling and swimming, we solve those learning barriers by identifying the risks and creating learning strategies that were focused on reducing the risk. And in juggling, the risk is not physical; it's something else. So the emphasis on social and emotional learning outcomes first and foremost is really how we are going to transform our expectations for those outcomes, right? We want to increase the accessibility of, or to transform the success rates of our classical teaching models. We need to put less emphasis on the technical outcomes and more emphasis on the social and emotional learning process of those outcomes. Another key, one of the ways we do this, a huge emphasis, and you can try this out for yourself. You can experiment with these activities. This lesson plan I just gave you, you can try teaching this lesson plan, given technical instruction to different groups of people, and see how well it goes. And then you can try to deliver it using narrative-based instruction. I think depending on who you are, your personality type, so not everyone's comfortable with this. It's a very playful way of learning, you know? So if you are like a technical juggling instructor, you might feel at first like, oh, this is too childish. Why am I doing this? Or even, why would I do that with adults? You might think, oh, I'll do that with children, but not with adults. No, do this with everyone. Do this with everyone. It works well for everyone. And then the way you can validate that idea for yourself is to try to explain without using narrative instruction and see how well that goes for you. See what type of environment that creates, what type of emotional response it creates from your students, and see how they're responding to the learning process, whether it's positive or negative, just by changing the way we communicate the ideas. We also really put a strong emphasis on creating opportunities for students to solve the problems themselves, not to give instruction, but to just give opportunities to learn. Once we begin to engage with juggling, like there's only so many ways, like it has a formula structure, right? So when you're playing with its equations, if you start to do it in a one way that is wrong, if I prevent you from doing that thing that's wrong, that gives you an opportunity to look for the other solutions that are usually right in front of you. It's an approach that takes a little bit of patience, right? I have to be confident that if I give my student the opportunity to discover the idea, that they will discover it. And that's going to take time. That's going to take practice from you guys, you know, experience, seeing how people respond. But just from the beginning to encourage you, it's an approach that requires more patience, but it has more positive outcomes. And even if it doesn't reach those outcomes, because we're being patient, because we're being sensitive of the person's learning process, they are going to come back. And as long as they keep coming back, they can keep learning, right? Another huge part is that we want to structure as many accomplishments built in as we can to increase emotional resilience to failure, to improve confidence and perseverance. Because ultimately, to learn to toss, juggle a three-ball cascade, that's a process that requires failure. There's no way to learn that without failing. Like you have to fail to get feedback and do all that thing. But it's a different type of failure than they were experiencing, you know, than you would experience with like the functional juggling ideas. So the way that we counteract that, and one of the ways we counteract that, is to give a sense of accomplishment. Having a sense of trying something new and succeeding at it, the more often I do that, the more likely I am to believe that you can give me another challenge and I will continue to succeed at that challenge, right? So we want to not distort, but enhance a person's sense of confidence throughout this lesson plan as well. Because we know that if a person believes in themselves, then they can do something. If a person doesn't believe in themselves, it doesn't matter what teaching method I use. And then the other thing is creative expression as part of the learning process. So not waiting, not changing this expectation that you have to learn to juggle the three ball cascade, you have to learn a bunch of tricks, and then you can start to be creative with it. No, absolutely not. We can all be creative. We can all be expressive with juggling from day one. People interact with juggling all the time. They don't know it. People create juggling all the time. They don't know it. Um, it's not something we need to have an advanced skill level to do. So we also need to change this expectation that creativity, the creative side of juggling, is something that comes after its technical side. The creative side comes first. And if we present juggling in that way, then it really makes the teaching process a lot easier because it creates motivation, it creates personalization, it has a value, it has a meaning. And then artistically, as our industry continues to develop, if we continue to focus on this idea of juggling being a form of expression, a language, like dance and music, then I think we're going to see a lot more diversity in our industry as well, um, and a lot more applications. These are things I would like to see. To review the points from today, juggling cannot be defined by its action. It is a formula experience that both distorts and describes our sensory relationship with space-time. So we're going to get into this more and more. Today was about deconstruction. We're going to reconstruct this formula in the coming weeks, in the coming classes. But today it's just about shifting our perspective to get away from this idea of understanding juggling by its action. Maybe if you don't understand the formula, that's okay. You don't understand the formula yet. What's important is that you understand that maybe describing juggling by its action might not actually be the most logical, might not be the most intelligent way to understand it. There might be another way to understand it. And then to be open to this idea of this formula and seeing how we start to, by creating a formula, by saying now our goal is not to develop a technique. Now our goal is to develop a sensory relationship with space and time. What activities should we be presenting? What other ways can we develop that understanding of juggling as opposed to its technical form? That's where I want us to be today. The impacts of juggling are universal and relative to the individual time a person spends engaged with its state of mind. This is something I think I would love to see us make a huge cultural shift in understanding, and really starting to put juggling in the categories that it deserves to be, and recognizing juggling and placing it next to the things that it belongs to, which is meditation, yoga, dance, and music. And all of these are activities which we have a really strong understanding are relative to each individual's experience. That's why they're so therapeutic. That's why they're so easy to apply as forms of intervention. Music therapy, it lends itself so well. Yoga therapy as well is accessible. And this is because all of these activities share this thing in common. Their major impacts, the primary benefits that these activities are all collectively offering is the state of mind that they present. And that state of mind is relevant to each individual's experience. It's not related to its skill level. So not only are we moving to a place now where we're looking at describing juggling not by its action, which should make it physically, if we're successful in that goal, we'll make it physically accessible. But beyond that physical accessibility, it's sort of like universally accessible to every individual, because this is a state of mind that's personal as well. It's not telling you, it's not developing any particular outcome. It's enhancing who you are, right? So I don't even decide what the impact of this is for you. You decide. It's personal, because it's a state of mind that's an overall enhancing our ability to communicate with ourselves and with our environments. And the impacts of that, I think, are profound. Juggling itself is not an inaccessible activity, but rather we make it inaccessible through cultural misunderstandings and failed teaching practices. And this is a part where, I want to be sensitive to us. I don't want anyone to feel ashamed or guilty if you're coming to this realization now, like, oh crap, I've been teaching juggling this way for so long. And yeah, now I think about all those students that had negative experiences and I've been doing something wrong. I'm a bad person. No, you are not a bad person. You are using the tools that you had. You are using the understanding that we all have had. And I made those same mistakes for many, many years. And I'm okay to live with the consequences because I'm able to fix that. I'm able to change it going forward, to find new solutions that are going to ensure that the learning process is not negative, that it's not abusive, that it's not traumatizing for anyone. And then slowly over time, as we begin to share this way and make these adjustments, these cultural misunderstandings will go away. These failures will disappear into the past, and people will not see juggling as an inaccessible activity because we will stop to make it inaccessible, right? So I think it's important, like, I celebrate this recognition of error. I think we should all be, celebrating anytime we recognize our errors. And I don't know if there's anyone in this group that is offended by this material, but I just like to take the time to stress that, it's not intended to offend anyone. It's really intended to help us move forward. And then the key thing behind this inaccessibility, it has to do with, the determination of it by its action, but also significantly on the way we choose to teach it, because we use this classical lazy model of scaffolding that seems logical from at first glance, but when you really start to break down what that learning process is like, and how that learning process doesn't have any opportunity for sensory feedback as part of its learning process. All the responsibility is put on the student to reach that end goal if they want to have the sensation, when it should be the other way around, when it should always be the other way around. And when we make this comparison to music, or we make this comparison to bicycling and swimming, then it becomes really obvious to us that it needs to be the other way around. We don't even ask a question whether it should be the other way around in those situations, because we know that if we don't make it the other way around, then more people get hurt and more people get injured. Whereas in juggling, we don't have that consequence, so we never thought to deconstruct this linear model of learning. And then the emphasis of social and emotional learning strategies outweighs those of technical. So overall, like maybe you're not convinced yet, you're going to need to apply this lesson and observe for yourself. Am I getting higher success rates? And reflect on what's causing those higher success rates, and reflect on how your students, the environment of your classrooms, how much fun is in your classroom. Like, do your students seem stressed out? Do they seem self-conscious, or do they seem free? Because if we can make them free in their learning process, then the juggling itself is inaccessible. We don't have to do anything else. And this is something you're going to see more and more and more as we start to change our value for juggling, as we start to change our intention of teaching juggling. That is really an emotional learning process. Juggling is a personal experience. Music is a personal experience. And I think dance, so we have so many great educational models for dance, and how to approach dance as an emotional learning process, and dance as a language. So a lot of the solutions are already there. It's just about us shifting our frame of mind about juggling, and moving juggling away from wherever it's been before, in terms of having this sort of proximity to athletics or sport, and really recognize it for what it is, which is art. Because we can have this debate. Everyone is free to have their different interpretation of what juggling means, and what juggling represents. But if you look at the state of mind that juggling produces, that is a state of mind that is being produced only by other artistic activities. Everything that we culturally recognize as being art causes this state of mind to occur, causes us to detach from our linear sense of time, causes our egos to be reduced, causes our brains to process information in this altered state. So whether or not you think juggling is art is irrelevant to, that's your opinion. If you don't think it's art, that's only your opinion. Science tells us it is. And I think if we can start to shift and look to those other activities that equally represent the same state of mind, and we can learn a lot from those. So this is why having people in the group with mixed background is so beneficial. And all of you at the beginning, it's funny for, me and Mark, we laugh at you guys like, oh, I'm not a juggler. I don't know if this is going to work for me. It's going to work so well for you. Because it's about finding these transferable points, and seeing that a lot of the juggling community needs you guys, this diversity. We need this diversity, because the people who are here right now, I think it's not necessarily so diverse in its community in terms of who the leaders are, and we need to see more diversity in that leadership of juggling if we're going to make this change, right? So I welcome you all here because of that. To summarize, or to drive a point home, there is no confusion or doubt over the unique benefits juggling has to offer, right? But there are some concerns over the perceived levels of inaccessibility. So everybody wants the impacts, the benefits of juggling, but not everyone is sure that those benefits are accessible. Certainly any school system would be delighted to have their students benefit from the unique impacts of learning how to juggle, especially now. Especially there's so much shifting going on in education right now, and a lot of that is being affected by our economy, right? It's industry that determines the model of education that we've used throughout history. And we're still working with this model of education that's trying to produce factory workers, right? And we don't have an economy that works that way anymore. Right now, society needs more innovators, technology. The model is innovate or die now if you are a corporation. So society needs people who can deal with creating new ideas more than repeating information, which is our existing model of learning that we have in mainstream education. But because juggling is not considered accessible for everyone, it fails to meet the criteria for universal implementation. So if we can start to use things like the 5-step juggling model, if we can start to make things like the juggle board and functional juggling more accessible, then people are going to start to understand that this thing that we thought was inaccessible actually isn't, and that all these benefits are inclusive. And we are going to start making more partnerships. We're going to start seeing juggling become more predominant in mainstream education, not just in mainstream education, and other practices as well. Just like we saw this transformation take place with meditation and yoga, right? Art therapy as well. Once those industries made that transition and made that relationship clear to society, we saw a lot of growth in those industries, and we saw those industries start to contribute a lot of wonderful interventions as well. So that's what we're hoping to do with juggling through this course. It was within our power to create such barriers, then it is within our responsibility to do something about it as well. This is what I believe. I have no doubt over our ability to make juggling accessible for everyone, because it was within our ability to make it inaccessible. So we can do both. For your homeworks, we encourage you to have read the whole book by the start of this class, but if you haven't, that's okay. I'm going to let you know week to week what chapters you should be read up to. If you already read the book, it can be helpful to review. Depends how serious you are. You know, if you want to get down like that, you can. I'm not going to stop anyone from studying more. But so try to read up to chapter 10, and then find at least one person who does not know how to juggle and experiment with teaching them using this 5-step method. So your homework assignment is try to play with this. I might suggest you to try to look for one-on-one opportunities or small groups first, like 1 to 3 people at a time, just as you start to learn its steps, and then and then bigger as you go. And then if you can, if we have time, it's nice. I'm going to agree. I can take off the screen share now because I really want to see my students. I don't see you guys. There you are. Hello. Nice to see you. I hope you all enjoyed that experience.